It was a self-imposed rule. Valerie Justice would not date anyone until her 15-year-old daughter, Erin, graduated high school in their Naperville, Illinois town.
Erin and I were extremely close. I had been divorced for 6 years, and she was the joy of my life. I wanted to get married again, but I wanted to concentrate on getting her through high school first. After that, I could get on with my own personal life.
But in 2003, when Erin spent her summer vacation with her father, Valerie soon felt a void in her heart.
I missed Erin tremendously, so I would visit my mother often because we lived not too far away from each other, and she was retired, and she was babysitting all the time.
And one afternoon, while visiting her mother, Valerie was happy to bump into a familiar face, 37-year-old Lawrence Lovejoy.
My mother had started babysitting for his little girl. And so many times when I would go by my mom's house, he was there. Lawrence was going through a divorce, and he was actually spending quite a bit of time there at my mom's. He was a little rough around the edges, just a t-shirt and jeans kind of person. But he was funny, and he was very charming.
Well, Lawrence was easygoing, and he was easy to talk to. He worked as a painter. He was trying to get back on his feet.
Lawrence had been mentioned to my mother that he was looking for a place to stay. So I made the suggestion that since Erin was gone for the summer, he could share my apartment. He'd have a place to stay. I'd have some help with the rent. And I thought that would be a good arrangement.
Lawrence thought so too, and was more than happy to accept.
I would look forward to going home knowing that someone was there. He was rather entertaining. He made me laugh. We started spending time together.
My sister Valerie was very serious, and Lawrence was the funny guy. Valerie needed that break in her seriousness by his sense of humor.
By the end of the summer, Valerie decided to break her own rule.
One of the goals that he had expressed to me was to own a home. And I've always wanted to own my own home. He wanted to really progress through life. I found myself attracted to him, and then we ended up in a relationship.
But when Erin returned home in August, she made it known she wasn't keen on having a man around the house.
It was hard for her to imagine anyone else being in the house besides her and I. She didn't want to lose her privacy. But I did not want to end the relationship.
But Valerie did want to do things right.
So at that point in my life, it was my desire to be more Christian. I did not want to continue to live with Lawrence without being married to him.
So Lawrence came up with the perfect solution.
Lawrence looked me straight in the face and told me, and would I marry him? Yes, yes. So I did say yes, that I would marry him.
After 4 months together, Valerie and Lawrence tied the knot at the local courthouse with Erin by their side.
So it was a simple ceremony. No big wedding dress, no flowers. We walked out and we were holding hands and we were on our way. The future seemed very bright.
But that brightness would soon turn to darkness as Valerie realized the choice she made would destroy everything she held dear.
He had a whole nother side to him.
She had no idea this monster was lurking in her house.
I just cried and cried. I just could not believe that he would do something so vicious.
In November of 2003, newlyweds Valerie Justice and Lawrence Lovejoy were eager to start their life together with Valerie's teenage daughter, Erin.
I was excited. I had everything that at this point that I desired. I had my daughter by my side. I was married again, And we started the process of trying to see if we could qualify for a mortgage and buy a home.
It was very important to Valerie to become a homeowner. They were on the hunt for the right house that they could all be happy in.
But the following month, Valerie came home to find Lawrence and Aaron in a screaming match.
Lawrence was so enraged, they were yelling back and forth. He was very upset that Aaron had been on the phone all afternoon, supposedly talking to boys. I didn't quite understand why he was so concerned.
There was a disconnect in their parenting styles. Lawrence felt he was going to be the one to discipline her, but Valerie didn't feel it was Lawrence's place.
I informed him that any decisions that had to do with Aaron were to be totally left up to me. He really got upset because I was basically telling him that I don't need your help. And he wasn't happy about that.
So Valerie did her best to smooth things over.
I talked to Aaron and, asked her to just wait until I'm home, before you get on the phone, and then that way there won't be any problems.
For the next few months, things seemed to be going according to plan.
There were no more big blowouts between Aaron and Lawrence. We bought a new puppy for the family, and we're making plans to purchase a townhome.
But there were a few sacrifices. Valerie took on a second job as a cashier to earn extra money for closing costs, which meant Aaron was at times a latchkey kid.
Erin would come home on her own, and I would call her and check in on her. So, we had a good system of keeping in touch with each other. Plus, Lawrence was home during the day, and then he worked the midnight shift at his company.
And Valerie couldn't help but notice that Aaron and Lawrence seemed to be fighting less often.
Aaron was in driver's ed, and so Lawrence volunteered to take her out driving. When they got home, they were both laughing, and I was relieved to see that things were getting better.
So Valerie set her sights on the closing of their new house, which was set for March 5th, 2004. But just 2 days before the closing, when Valerie made a routine call home to check on Aaron, everything changed.
Aaron answered the phone, and I said, "What are you doing?" She sounded just kind of aloof. Are you okay? Like she was preoccupied. Okay. We got off the phone, but something just didn't sit right with me.
And when Valerie received a call just a short time later from a police officer, she knew in an instant something was terribly wrong.
Lawrence had a dark side.
It was just a nightmare.
I was in complete shock. What he did was just devastating.
On March 3rd, 2004, Valerie Justice felt a knot in her stomach after receiving a call from the local police.
The police officer said that they had my daughter. There was a problem. He said that I needed to come to this address he gave me. That's all he would tell me. I hung up the phone with him. I was scared. Now I'm like, what the heck's going on?
Valerie was in a panic as she immediately raced to the address.
I just had no idea what could possibly be the problem. When I arrived, the police officer immediately took me up to an apartment. It was a friend of Aaron's who she went to school with.
Officers led Valerie into the living room, where she found Aaron sitting on the couch, visibly shaken.
That's when the police officer told me, according to Aaron, that Lawrence had sexually assaulted her. So I said, "What do you mean?" Aaron said she had come home from track practice. And Lawrence offered to give her a massage. She told him to stop, and he just kept going. I was shocked. After all, he had a daughter of his own. And it really upset me. I was like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I'm listening to what she is saying, and I'm trying to absorb it all. I didn't want to believe that this was really happening. But I made it very clear to Erin that I was going to support her no matter what.
At the hospital, Valerie stood by Erin's side as a doctor administered a rape kit.
The doctor told me that there were no physical signs of penetration. That put a shadow of a doubt in my mind. I was struggling with the whole thing. I questioned her, and I said, if this for some reason was because you're having a problem with him, I said, tell me now, because this is pretty serious. But she assured me that she was telling the absolute truth.
At first, I just didn't believe it. I was like, no, that just can't be. He's just not like that.
Meanwhile, at the police station, Lawrence told investigators something else entirely.
Lawrence indicated that Erin was just upset at him because he had questioned her cell phone usage. And because he was questioning her, she made the entire story up.
Without a confession, police didn't have enough to hold him.
There was saliva found on her cheek and on her breast. And it was the decision of the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office not to file charges until the DNA results came back from the crime lab. So Lawrence was not arrested that evening.
In the meantime, Valerie had saved enough money to close on the townhouse herself and settled on a new living arrangement, which didn't include Lawrence.
I got everything moved, and I didn't really know where he was staying. And I told Lawrence I did not want him around my daughter until we had gotten the DNA results. If the DNA results came back positive, my plan was to divorce Lawrence immediately.
But just a few weeks later, Valerie found herself in a bind and was compelled to ask Lawrence for a favor.
The puppy had gotten sick and needed to have a follow-up appointment with the vet. I asked Lawrence, and he made the appointment, and he was going to take her to the vet.
There was no chance Erin would run into Lawrence at the house, since she was going to spend the week with her father. But at the last minute, Erin's father canceled.
He was supposed to pick her up in the morning, but he had called to say that he was not going to be able to do that. So I called Lawrence, and I told him that he would need to move the puppy's appointment. And then he said to me, okay, I will call the vet and do that right now. So I was relieved.
Within the hour, Valerie decided to check in on her daughter and make sure she was waking up.
When I called, I didn't get any answer. And I'm wondering, why isn't she answering? I started to get a little anxious. I finally went to my boss and I said, I just need to go home and check and see what's going on. I was thinking, maybe she just overslept, maybe she was in the shower. But, I had no idea. No idea.
And when Valerie arrived home, nothing could have prepared her for the horror she would find.
It was the most heinous attack that I have ever seen.
It was unimaginable what he did.
There was blood everywhere. My whole world just ended.
On the morning of March 27, 2004, Valerie Justice prayed that her daughter Erin was okay as she arrived home.
I started to call her name and was not getting any response. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. I got into the hallway, and I could tell there was something on the walls. I ran into her bedroom, and she's not in her bed. Across the hall was her bathroom. I pushed the bathroom door open. I saw Erin in the bathtub. There was blood all over the floor. I knew when I saw her that it was too late. I felt like I was suspended in space. It just felt like I was just spinning.
Stunned with horror, Valerie ran to the hall and called 911.
Now all I can remember is the dispatcher telling me that I have to stop screaming and that they were sending somebody over. I just sat down on the stairs. I couldn't move.
Police arrived within minutes and found that whoever had murdered Erin resorted to a disturbing level of violence.
Erin was stabbed, she was bludgeoned, and then she was drowned. Erin had lethal doses of cold medication in her system. I believe she was forced to take it. There was a rather deep knife wound to her neck. Whoever did this had a lot of hatred in them. It was the most brutal, vicious, heinous attack that I have ever seen.
And Lawrence Lovejoy quickly rose to the top of the list as a person of interest.
The next day, we began interviewing Lawrence Lovejoy. From 7 until 12:30, he could not account for what he did and where he was at. But we didn't have enough evidence to keep him, so we had to let him go.
As investigators continued to gather evidence, Valerie tried to come to grips with what had happened.
It was so hard to fathom that someone could be that evil and do that to a helpless child. I knew in my gut that Lawrence was responsible for my daughter's death.
So I went to Copley Hospital. When I got there, all the kids was there. And I realized that it was real.
3 months later, the DNA found on Erin during the alleged rape came back as a positive match to Lawrence Lovejoy. And when police identified Lawrence's footprint at the crime scene, there was no denying that he was Erin's killer.
I believe Lawrence Lovejoy went over there to try to talk her out of filing charges against him for a sexual assault because he thought the results would come back with his DNA. And Erin was not giving that to him. He killed her in such a brutal way, I think he just snapped.
On August 20th, 2004, Lawrence Lovejoy was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Erin Justice. 1 month later, he was indicted on charges of sexual assault and sexual abuse.
I was absolutely sick to my stomach. I felt responsible. It was me who allowed this monster into our lives. It hits me like a brick.
Valerie now realized that Lawrence must have become obsessed with Erin.
His rage about Erin being on the phone was out of place. He had some jealous rage against Erin talking to boys. I think the reason why Lawrence offered to take Erin driving that day was to gain her confidence. Maybe she would feel close to him. But he didn't know my Erin.
In 2007, Lawrence Lovejoy went to trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. In light of his conviction, the sexual assault and abuse charges were dropped. But because of a technicality with a blood test, the conviction was overturned 2 years later.
That was discouraging, but we knew we had to go to trial on this again. It was going to be another guilty.
Finally, in 2011, Lawrence Lovejoy was once again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison.
It was rather bittersweet when Lawrence was convicted and didn't bring my daughter back. But I was glad that he couldn't be free to harm anyone else.
Today, Valerie is still haunted by Erin's death and wonders if she could have done more to protect her.
I never saw any sign that I needed to fear for my daughter's life. There just were no signs that he would have been capable of such horrible actions.
It was really tough. It hurts every day. But it's through the faith and conviction that we all carry on.
I know that in this world no one's perfect, but Aaron was perfect for me. We were a perfect fit. I look forward to seeing.
Living near a place called Holiday, Florida might seem like fun, but for Crystal Kunkel, life was far from a tropical vacation. In the spring of 2002, after ending a 3-year relationship with the father of her newborn, the 22-year-old found herself transforming from a carefree young woman into a caregiver.
It had been 4 months since the last relationship. I was a single mother working really long hours at a window treatment company. I had a 6-month-old son, and between working and taking care of my son, I felt like I was going to have to juggle work and motherhood alone forever.
Romance seemed like a thing of the past until one day that March when Crystal saw a glimmer of hope.
My dad and I worked together, and I saw him and this guy, and I noticed that he was attractive, good-looking.
This is my daughter, Crystal. Oh, I don't think we've met before.
As Crystal's father introduced her to Tommy Garcia, one of her co-workers, she could tell right away that the 28-year-old was different.
The first thing I noticed was he was outgoing and nice.
And her instinct was confirmed over the next several weeks.
Tommy treated me really nice and sweet, and he would chat in his spare time at work. It seemed like he really liked me. I decided to show Tommy a picture of my son.
Oh my gosh, he has your eyes. Beautiful.
Tommy told me that he also had a young son. He was trying to get full custody of him. It gave Tommy and I a connection and made me feel like he was a really good family guy.
A few weeks later, Crystal and Tommy were eager to take their idle office chit-chat off the clock.
We would spend time with my son and with his son. I was having a lot of fun, and we were really falling in love.
Over the next 4 months, the two became inseparable and decided to take the next step.
I love being here with you. What if I moved in here with you?
Of course. It was great to have someone you could finally connect with and help raise my son. Tommy was like a single mother's dream come true.
So when Tommy took Crystal out for a romantic dinner on March 29, 2003, and popped the question,
Crystal, will you be my lawfully wedded wife?
Yeah.
she didn't have to think twice.
Tommy seemed to be nice and genuine. And he treated my grandson wonderfully. And I was very happy for both of them.
Although the lovebirds initially planned their nuptials for the following year, another joyous event soon eclipsed those plans.
About 6 months later, we found out we would be having a baby. So we decided to postpone the wedding.
In February of 2004, Crystal gave birth to another bouncing baby boy, while Tommy gained custody of his 6-year-old son and adopted Crystal's first child. And 1 year later, the two were united as one in a magical wedding ceremony.
I had the perfect dress, perfect cake, everything was perfect.
It was a very good wedding, very nice, perfect start to a family.
We were both really happy. But having all these kids, we needed a little bit more money, so I decided that I would work at a local pharmacy, and Tommy took a job at a landscaping company.
For the next 6 years, the Garcias lived busy lives with a full house. But in October 2011, Crystal started to notice a slight shift in Tommy's typically predictable behavior.
He started to have some weird problems with the car. He called me about an hour after work one day saying that he was going to get the tire fixed. And he said he would be home in about another half an hour.
And when Tommy came home late again the following week, citing more tire trouble, Crystal was puzzled.
He said, well, they must have never fixed it right the first time. I didn't have really any reason to doubt him, but I thought it was really weird.
Then, a few weeks later, things took an even stranger turn.
We were getting ready to head out for the day, and my son asked me for a toy out of the car. So I went to the car. I was looking for my son's toy. I saw this gun laying underneath the seat.
What are you doing?
In November 2011, after finding a gun in her husband Tommy's car, Crystal Garcia was starting to worry something was afoot.
What are you doing?
What is this?
Nothing, all right? It's a pellet gun. It shoots air.
Tommy immediately got mad that I found it. And I said, "What are you getting so mad about?" Then he justified it, saying he played with it at work. I guess they would do different guy things during lunch. I thought they're all guys that work together. Maybe they do play with pellet guns, I don't know.
Why is it underneath the seat with all the toys? What if one of the kids had found it?
Look, it's nothing, all right? Just relax. I got it.
I thought it was kind of weird and suspicious that he was so mad about the situation.
Then, a few weeks later, as the couple attended a family event, Crystal noticed something creepy.
Tommy was talking to two young teenage girls, telling them that they were smart and beautiful.
You're going out really nicely.
Seemed really inappropriate, and the girls felt a little uncomfortable by the advance he had made.
It turned the picnic into an awkward situation. I just found it very off base and unacceptable.
I felt embarrassed, so I confronted Tommy. He said that they'd taken it all wrong. That wasn't what he meant by it. He just justified it again, that everything was fine.
And on the night of February 15th, 2012, her husband's strange behavior reached its peak.
Tommy would play basketball with his friends, and he would usually come home around 10 o'clock at night, and it was getting to be 11:30 at night, and I started to get worried. And I was mad because he was out so late and he hadn't called.
Finally, Tommy walked in the door.
It's about time.
He was hyper, he was talking really fast. He was really excited. So I said, "What are you doing coming home so late?" He didn't think it was a big deal that he didn't call or anything. He said, "I had to get the tire filled up with air." I was angry that it was another tire story. Just didn't really seem like it could be true.
Air in the tire.
Yeah, in the gas station. I found this phone.
Then he told me that he also found this phone by the air pumps. He said it's a brand new phone. He said he checked in the gas station and they didn't know who it belonged to.
Nobody claimed it, so I figured one of our kids could use it.
Then he told me that he wanted to give our son the cell phone. I asked to look at the phone, but he wouldn't let me see it. He said that there was no information on it. It had been wiped clean. I thought it was kind of weird that there was this new phone that all the information had been erased from. I didn't really think it made sense.
Crystal told me Tommy was acting a little odd, and I told her just to keep her eyes open and make sure he's not just telling stories.
I found Tommy's behavior really confusing, and I didn't really know what to do to get to the bottom of it.
But Crystal wouldn't have to wait long.
The next night I was at work and I got a phone call.
Hello?
It was Tommy. He said that I needed to come home.
I need you to come home right away.
What's going on?
Miss Garcia?
Police officer got on the phone. I thought, oh my God.
In February 2012, after getting a call from her husband Tommy, Crystal Garcia was completely caught off guard when a police officer got on the line and said Tommy was being arrested.
What's going on?
The police officer said, "You're gonna need to come home and watch the kids."
And then the police officer told her why.
What? I was completely shocked, and I thought that there was some kind of mistake. I couldn't believe my husband could do that.
I'm on my way.
Her mind reeling, Crystal raced home.
I pulled onto our street. There was cop cars everywhere. My car was being seized. It was like something out of a movie. I was completely shocked, completely devastated that everything seemed to be falling apart right in front of me. The kids were in the window. Seeing the kids, the lights flashing, it was all like a nightmare. And my sons were looking at their father in handcuffs in front of the house. I felt that they shouldn't have to see something like that. They're probably scared.
Ms. Garcia, can't talk to him right now. We're going to process them.
The cops didn't let me say anything. They didn't let him talk. They just told him, "Kiss me goodbye."
The next morning, when Tommy called from jail, he assured his wife that it was all a huge misunderstanding.
He told me that he did know the woman, and he said, "It's not what you think. I gave a girl a ride home once, and she'd made an advance, and he'd turned her down, and she was upset and accusing him of rape." I thought that was a little weird. But I felt like there was really no reason for me not to trust him. I just hoped that it was true what he was saying.
But when a detective showed up the next day, her faith in Tommy's story really began to wane.
He said this girl who had been raped lost something, and we've been looking for it, and we can't seem to find it anywhere.
You haven't found your cell phone.
And I said, "Oh my God."
Crystal's heart sank as she remembered Tommy giving their son a cell phone he said he found. And then the detective dropped a bombshell.
3 additional rape charges have been placed against Tommy.
Altogether, there's 4 rape charges and 2 kidnapping charges.
The detective explained that after Tommy's arrest, they discovered evidence that could tie him to 3 other rapes.
It felt like the whole world was crashing down. I was completely devastated. I couldn't believe that this could happen.
Crystal tried to stand on her own and try to muscle through it. She wanted to believe her husband was innocent. She wanted to believe that in the worst way.
I wanted to see what was really going on. So I got the police records at the county building, and I read the whole report.
Crystal was completely blindsided as she read that Tommy had admitted to being with all the victims. Devastated, she immediately confronted her husband at jail the next day.
Stop.
I said, "I just looked at the police report, and it says you admitted to the police that you were with all of these women."
You read her report.
I said, "You told me that everybody was lying, the cops were lying, and this girl was lying." I said, "At what point are you lying?"
God, tell me the truth.
It was really the first moment where I knew he was lying.
Believe me.
I was really mad that not only that he'd done it, that he led me on to believe that he didn't do it. It was just coming to me all at once. I couldn't believe that he could do this to me, to the kids, to everybody. So I decided I was filing for a divorce. I felt like this is it. I'm done.
And as prosecutors prepared for Tommy's trial, Crystal would finally learn the whole truth. And it was more horrendous than she could have possibly imagined.
It was unbelievable.
This was just the tip of the iceberg.
It was just unreal to believe. I felt like I was with somebody I never knew.
In July of 2013, Crystal Garcia was still in shock when her husband Tommy went to trial for sexual battery and kidnapping and had been charged with 3 other possible rapes.
I had cried pretty much every day, like I couldn't believe that this had happened to me and happened to the kids.
In court, the horrible details of the crime finally came to light.
The night he came home from basketball with the cell phone, Tommy had been driving down the road and he saw a woman.
Tommy drove by this woman and asked her if she wanted a ride.
I said no.
And he came back a second time. And she said no again.
I said get in the car!
They drove up to the wooden area, and he forced her out of the car and performed several sexual acts.
Then he took her phone so she wasn't able to call for help. And as she was driving away,
She was able to follow his taillights out of the area. She was able to flag down a motorist and call the police. She was able to give a description of the car and actually a description of the perpetrator. Police used that information to put together a DMV photo array from which she was able to identify Tommy Garcia.
Between the victim's testimony, her cell phone, and DNA evidence that conclusively linked him to the crimes, there was no denying Tommy was the rapist. On July 26, 2013, after 2 days of testimony, Tommy Garcia was found guilty on both counts.
it was completely crazy that he definitely did it, that this was him. It was just unreal to believe.
It's a shocking thing to think somebody you've been married to is someone like that, a monster.
On the same day as the verdict, Tommy Garcia was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and labeled a sexual predator. 7 months later, he pled guilty to the 3 other rape cases and received a 15-year sentence.
I felt like that I was with somebody I never knew. I was devastated. I couldn't believe that I'd married somebody that was capable of something so horrible.
Knowing the awful truth about her husband, Crystal couldn't help but wonder if there were even more victims out there.
The times when he was having car problems, I wonder if there was more to it.
And she could barely stomach thinking of the young girls he had flirted with.
I worry that when he looked at other young people that maybe he had ulterior motives.
It's really unusual for someone who rapes to not have a history of other kind of violent or aggressive behavior. But we are not surprised to find that there may be others, and we have to hope others who have been their victims will come forward.
Seems just so unreal that he was somebody that I lived with. You know, you lock your doors every night and try to keep the bad people out, and really, I just locked the bad person in.
Today, Crystal still struggles with why her husband would suddenly choose such a dark path after 6 years of marriage.
There weren't any signs. He had a good family. He was good for so long, but something was wrong. Something snapped inside of him. I don't think I'll ever have all the answers.
He had everyone fooled. My parents, my grandparents, the whole family.
But Crystal is determined to put all the painful memories behind her.
I now wonder, do you ever really know somebody? But I'm doing good, and the boys are happy. My life is going in the right direction.
The heat in Southern California has a way of preserving things. It bakes the asphalt until it shimmers like a mirage. It bleaches the color from the billboards lining the 405, and in the summer of 1985, it seemed to seal the sprawling suburbs of Orange County in a capsule of golden, untouchable perfection. This was the era of the endless summer, a time when the American dream wasn't just a concept. It was a physical reality you could touch. It was in the manicured St. Augustine grass that felt like carpet under bare feet. It was in the smell of chlorine drifting from backyard pools, mixing with the scent of blooming jasmine and exhaust fumes. It was a time of neon lycra, synth-pop anthems blasting from rolled-down windows, and a pervasive, intoxicating belief that if you lived here, behind the stucco walls and the wrought iron gates, you were safe. But safety is a fragile illusion. It is a thin sheet of glass that we convince ourselves is a fortress. And on a Tuesday in mid-August, on a street named Calle de la Paz, Street of Peace, that glass didn't just crack. It shattered into a million jagged pieces, slicing through the heart of a community that prided itself on being the perfect place to raise a family. To understand the horror of what happened, you first have to understand the silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a neighborhood that is watching, waiting, and unknowingly holding its breath. The cul-de-sacs of 1985 were designed for privacy, for quiet domesticity. But that design also created the perfect hunting ground. High fences meant privacy, but they also meant that screams could be muffled. Perfectly trimmed hedges offered beauty, but they also offered cover. The very architecture of safety was weaponized against the people living inside it. Elena Sanchez was the embodiment of that suburban promise. 24 years old, a kindergarten teacher with eyes the color of dark espresso and a laugh that could disarm the grumpiest parent at a PTA meeting. She wasn't just a resident of the neighborhood. She was its heartbeat. She was the woman who remembered every child's birthday, the neighbor who left baskets of lemons from her backyard tree on your porch just because. She lived alone in a single-story bungalow, a charming cream-colored structure with terracotta tiles and a wind chime by the front door that sang in the Santa Ana winds. To the outside observer, Elena's life was an open book. She left for school at 7:15 a.m. sharp. She returned at 4:30 p.m. She jogged on weekends. She was predictable, reliable, and radiant. But predators don't look for chaos. They look for patterns. They study the rhythm of a life until they can slip into the gaps between the beats. And someone had been studying Elena. Someone had been watching the way the morning light hit her kitchen window, memorizing the rotation of her tires, counting the seconds it took for her to unlock her front door. August 13th, 1985. A Tuesday. The day began like any other, wrapped in the marine layer fog that rolls in off the Pacific before burning off by noon. But the rhythm was broken. At 7:15 a.m., Elena's driveway remained empty. The beige Honda Civic sat parked, cold and still. At the local elementary school, a room full of 5-year-olds sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, waiting for the teacher, who never missed a day. The principal, a stern but kindly woman named Margaret, checked her watch. 7:30, 7:45. The phone at Elena's house rang and rang, the shrill mechanical trill echoing in an empty hallway, unanswered. In 1985, we didn't have the digital tether of smartphones. If someone didn't answer, they were simply gone. There was no read receipt, no GPS to track. There was only the growing, gnawing pit in your stomach. By 10 a.m., the concern had shifted from annoyance to genuine alarm. Margaret called Elena's parents, who lived 2 towns over. They hadn't heard from her since Sunday dinner. The silence was thickening, congealing into something palpable. A patrol car was dispatched around 11:30 a.m. for a welfare check. It was a routine task, the kind that usually ends with a sheepish homeowner explaining they overslept or their phone was off the hook. Officer Jim Miller, a rookie with only 6 months on the force, took the call. He would later say that the drive to Calle de la Paz felt unusually long, the radio chatter fading into background static as he turned into the subdivision. The street was quiet. It was the middle of the work week. Most adults were at offices. Kids were at summer camp or inside watching cartoons. The sun was high now, casting short, sharp shadows. Miller parked his cruiser in front of Elena's house. The first thing he noticed was the newspaper. It was still on the driveway, wrapped in its plastic sleeve, baking in the heat. A small detail, but in a neighborhood of precision, it was a screaming anomaly. He walked up the path. The wind chime tinkled softly, a cheerful sound that felt discordant with a tightness in Miller's chest. He knocked. Hard. Police. Elena? Is anyone home? Silence. He walked around the perimeter. The windows were closed, the blinds drawn tight against the sun. He tried to peer through a crack in the living room drapes, but the interior was a cavern of shadows. He moved to the back, checking the sliding glass door. Locked. Everything was secure. It looked like a fortress. But as he circled back to the front, his boot crunched on something. He looked down. A single, crushed snail on the pristine walkway. And then he saw it. The front door. It wasn't wide open. It was cracked, just a fraction of an inch. The latch hadn't caught. It was resting against the frame, hovering in that liminal space between open and closed. Miller drew his service revolver, the weight of it familiar yet terrifying in his palm. He pushed the door with his fingertips. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing the cool, dim interior of the house. The air hit him first. It wasn't the smell of death, not yet. It was the smell of stagnation. The air conditioning was humming, recycling the same chilled air over and over. But underneath the artificial cold, there was something metallic. Something copper-sharp and primal. Police department. Call out if you're here. His voice sounded too loud, too aggressive for the stillness of the house. He stepped into the foyer. To his left, the kitchen was spotless. A coffee mug sat on the counter, rinsed and drying on a rack. A single banana lay in a fruit bowl. It was a snapshot of a life paused. He moved deeper, his shoes squeaking faintly on the polished hardwood. The living room was sunken, a popular architectural style of the 70s and 80s. He took 2 steps down. The television was off. The magazines on the coffee table were fanned out in a perfect arc. And then, his eyes adjusted to the gloom near the hallway entrance. Elena was there. She wasn't lying in a way that suggested a fall or a faint. She was positioned. The violence of the scene was immediate and overwhelming, a chaotic splash of red against the beige carpet that seemed to vibrate in the low light. She had been attacked with a ferocity that suggested not just anger, but a deep, personal hatred. Or perhaps something even colder, a total, dehumanizing indifference. Miller froze. The radio on his shoulder crackled, a dispatcher asking for a status update. He couldn't speak. He was 23 years old, and he was staring at the end of the world. He backed out of the room, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, trying not to disturb the sanctity of the horror. He stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, clutching the radio. Dispatch. I need backup. Ambulance. Detectives. Everything. Send everything. The minutes that followed stretched into hours. The sirens didn't wail. They approached with a low growl, respecting the gravity of the quiet street. The crime scene tape, yellow and stark, was strung up around the manicured lawn, fluttering in the warm breeze. It looked alien against the roses and the white picket fences. Neighbors began to emerge. The stay-at-home moms, the retirees, the delivery drivers. They gathered in small clusters, arms crossed, whispering behind their hands. Is it Elena? I saw her yesterday. Did you hear anything? I didn't hear anything. The shock wasn't just about the death. It was about the proximity. This was their street. That was their sidewalk. If something this dark could happen to Elena, the golden girl of the neighborhood, Then the locks on their own doors suddenly felt made of paper. Detectives arrived in unmarked sedans, men in cheap suits with weary eyes. They were the old guard, men who had seen the gritty side of Los Angeles spill over into the suburbs. Lead Detective Marcus Thorne lit a cigarette before he even crossed the tape, a violation of protocol that no one dared challenge. He had the face of a man who had read too many autopsies, etched with lines of cynicism. He ducked under the tape and walked into the house, leaving the bright world behind. Inside, the forensic team began their grim ballet. Flashbulbs popped, brief lightning storms illuminating the tragedy in harsh bursts of white light. They dusted for fingerprints. They vacuumed fibers. They photographed the blood spatter patterns, the position of the body, the untouched nature of the rest of the house. And that was the detail that haunted Thorne immediately. The house was undisturbed. There was no overturned furniture, no smashed lamps, no drawers pulled out and dumped on the floor in a frantic search for valuables. Elena's purse sat on the entry table, her wallet inside, full of cash. Her jewelry box in the bedroom was untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a chaotic break-in by a drug addict looking for a quick score. This was an execution, or a fantasy played out in real time. The killer had entered, presumably without force, committed an act of unspeakable brutality, and then vanished. Thorne stood in the center of the living room, pivoting slowly. He looked at the front door. No pry marks. He looked at the back door. Locked from the inside. The windows? Dust undisturbed on the sills. He had a key. Thorne muttered to no one. Or she let him in. The implication hung in the air, heavier than the humidity. If she let him in, she knew him. Or he was someone so disarming, so seemingly harmless, that her instinct for self-preservation never triggered. Outside, the perimeter was expanding. The news vans were arriving, their satellite dishes extending like mechanical flowers towards the sky. Murder in suburbia, the Chirins would read. Teacher found slain. The media circus was setting up its tent, ready to broadcast the tragedy to the entire state. But amidst the chaos, the shouting reporters and the weeping neighbors, a different kind of observation was happening. Across the street, 2 houses down, a man stood on his lawn. He was holding a garden hose, watering his hydrangeas. He watched the police tape flutter. He watched the coroner's van back into the driveway. He didn't look horrified. He didn't look panicked. He looked interested. Calm. He adjusted the nozzle on the hose, sending a fine mist over his flowers, the rainbows dancing in the spray. He nodded politely at a police officer walking by, a gesture of solidarity, of shared concern. David Sterling was his name. A father, an engineer, a pillar of the community. He stood there in his polo shirt and khaki shorts, the very image of the American dad. He watched them carry the body of the woman he had killed out of the house in a black bag. He watched the doors of the van close. And then, he turned off the water, coiled the hose neatly against the side of his house, and went inside to make a sandwich. The investigation that launched that afternoon would span decades. It would consume careers. It would break marriages. It would become a ghost story whispered at sleepovers. But on that first day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of violet and orange, a cruel beauty against the grim reality on the ground, there was only the mystery. The house on Calle de la Paz was now a tomb. The police sealed it, but they couldn't seal the fear that leaked out into the neighborhood. The sun went down, and for the first time in years, the streetlights didn't feel like beacons of safety. They felt like spotlights on a stage where a monster was still walking freely. Thorne sat in his car, staring at the house. He had no weapon, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just a body and a feeling in his gut that he was dealing with something he hadn't seen before. He looked at his notepad. It was blank. The killer had left nothing behind. Or so they thought. Because in 1985, the concept of DNA profiling was a whisper in the scientific community, a futuristic dream. Thorne couldn't see the microscopic specks of skin cells under Elena's fingernails. He couldn't see the invisible map that had been left on the carpet. He didn't know that the key to solving this case wasn't in a witness statement or a fingerprint database. It was biology itself. The night settled in. The crickets began their chorus. And in the house 2 doors down, David Sterling sat in his recliner, the blue light of the television flickering on his face. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was right there. A perfect neighbor in a perfect world, hiding in the most effective camouflage of all, the ordinary. And as the camera pulls back from the street, rising higher and higher until the houses become a grid of lights, we realize that the terror isn't that the killer is gone. The terror is that he never left. This is the story of the long shadow. The story of a silence that lasted 38 years. And the story of the tiny, invisible thread that would eventually pull a monster out of the dark. This is the Sanchez cold case. The first 48 hours of a homicide investigation are a contest against entropy. Every second that ticks by is a memory fading in a witness's mind, a microscopic fiber being blown away by the wind, a drop of blood oxidizing into obscurity. In the precinct, they call it the golden window, but for Detective Marcus Thorne and his team, that window felt like it was being boarded up before they could even climb through. The autopsy of Elena Sanchez was conducted on a Thursday morning, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. The medical examiner, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to Marcus, just a coincidence of a small county peril, was a man of few words and surgical precision. He stood over the stainless steel table, dictating his findings into a hanging microphone. The report was a catalogue of horrors, a clinical translation of the rage that had visited Calle de la Paz. But it was what he didn't find that turned the blood in Marcus Thorne's veins to ice. No sexual assault, the ME said, peeling off his latex gloves with a snap that echoed in the tiled room. No defensive wounds on the hands, suggesting she was taken completely by surprise or knew the attacker well enough to lower her guard. And Marcus? No foreign fingerprints. Thorne stared at the body, his jaw set hard. Impossible. The guy didn't float. He had to touch something. The doorknob, the walls, the weapon. He wore gloves, the ME replied flatly. Leather, likely. We found faint smudges on her wrists consistent with leather texture. But here's the kicker. I found a trace. Thorne's head snapped up. What kind of trace? Under the fingernails of her right hand, and a small, dried patch of saliva on her collar. It's biological. It's not hers. In 2024, this would be the moment the case broke open. The moment the music swells and the detectives high-five. But this was 1985. The word DNA was barely in the lexicon of the average street cop. It was the stuff of high-level academic journals, not police procedural work. The sample was too small for blood typing, the only tool they really had. It was a ghost of a clue, useless, microscopic, and maddening. Bag it, Thorne said, his voice heavy with defeat. Freeze it. Maybe the lab boys in Sacramento can figure out something in 10 years. He didn't know how prophetic those words were. The evidence, a tiny swatch of fabric and a scraping of fingernails, was placed into a plastic evidence bag, labeled with a black marker, Case 85 to 4022. Exhibit B. It was walked down to the basement evidence locker, a sprawling cage of wire mesh and dusty boxes. The officer on duty tossed it onto a metal shelf next to a stolen toaster and a bag of seized marijuana. There it sat, a ticking time bomb with a fuse that wouldn't be lit for decades. Meanwhile, the investigation above ground was spinning its wheels in the mud. The standard procedure handbook was thrown at the case. First, the boyfriend. It's always the boyfriend. Michael, a lanky architect with thick glasses and a shaky alibi, was hauled into interrogation room 1. For 12 hours, Thorne and his partner grilled him. They pushed, they yelled, they bluffed. They laid out photos of the crime scene, watching his pupils for a flicker of recognition or guilt. But Michael didn't crack, because there was nothing to crack. He just wept. He vomited into the trash can. He hyperventilated until the station nurse had to bring him a paper bag. His alibi, a late-night brainstorming session with 2 colleagues, checked out. He was released at 4 a.m., a broken man walking out into the pre-dawn mist, forever shadowed by the suspicion of his neighbors, but legally cleared. Then came the drifters, the transients, the weirdos. Every man with a rap sheet within a 20-mile radius was pulled in. The creepy janitor at the elementary school. The guy who pumped gas at the corner station who stared a little too long. It was a dragnet of desperation. The police were trying to find a monster that fit the mold, a dirty, chaotic, obvious predator. They were looking for a wolf that looked like a wolf. They weren't looking for the sheepdog. While the police chased shadows, the neighborhood prepared to bury its daughter. The funeral of Elena Sanchez was the kind of event that defines a community's history. The local church was overflowing. People stood in the aisles, fanning themselves with programs, the air thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. It was a sea of black wool and lace. And sitting in the fourth row, right behind the weeping family, was David Sterling. He was wearing a charcoal suit, impeccably pressed. His wife sat beside him, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Sterling looked somber, respectful. He wasn't drawing attention to himself, but he wasn't hiding either. He was the picture of the concerned neighbor. When the service ended and the coffin was carried out into the blinding California sun, Sterling stood near the church doors. He shook hands. He hugged Elena's mother. "If you need anything," he told her, his voice low and steady. "Anything at all. Mow the lawn, pick up the mail. Please. We are all devastated." Elena's mother, blinded by grief, looked into the eyes of the man who had murdered her daughter and saw only kindness. "Thank you, David," she whispered. "You're a good man." It is a scene that chills the blood. The audacity of it. The psychological compartmentalization required to do such a thing is almost alien. How does a human being shut off the part of their brain that screams guilty? For Sterling, it wasn't about shutting it off. It was about rewriting reality. In his mind, the act was done. It was a closed chapter. He was no longer the killer. He was the comforter. He derived a sick, secret power from the proximity. Every handshake was a thrill. Every sympathetic nod was a victory lap. He was dancing on the grave while the dirt was still fresh, and no one could hear the music but him. As August burned into September, the panic in the neighborhood began to curdle into a dull, aching paranoia. The media vans packed up their cables and drove away to the next tragedy. The headlines shrank from the front page to the local section, then to the obituaries, then to nothing. The teacher murder became the cold case. But for Detective Thorne, the silence was louder than the sirens. He developed a routine. Every night, before heading home to his own empty apartment, he would drive past the Sanchez house. He would sit in his car, watching the dark windows. He felt like he had failed her. He felt the eyes of the killer on him, mocking him from the shadows. One night, in late October, Thorne was parked on the street, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. He saw a figure walking a dog. It was Sterling. The man waved as he passed the unmarked police car. "Evening, detective," Sterling said, pausing by the window. "Any leads?" "The wife is. She's terrified, asking if we should sell the house." Thorne rolled down the window, the smell of autumn leaves and exhaust mixing in the air. He looked at Sterling. Really looked at him. He saw a man with a receding hairline, a soft chin, and eyes that seemed a little too flat. But he also saw a man who had no record, a steady job, and a wife who baked cookies for the precinct. "We're working on it, Mr. Sterling," Thorne rasped, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "Tell your wife to lock the doors. But we'll catch him." "I hope so," Sterling said. "For everyone's sake. Good night, detective." He walked away, the dog trotting happily beside him. Thorne watched him go, the taillights of a passing car illuminating Sterling's silhouette for a brief second before he vanished into the dark. Thorne felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a primitive warning instinct that he couldn't translate into logic. He shook it off. He's just a neighbor, he told himself. Stop seeing ghosts. But the ghosts were real. And the evidence that could prove it was currently frozen at -20 degrees in a basement 10 miles away. The year turned. 1985 became 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded, dominating the news. The world moved on. The for sale signs started popping up on Calle de la Paz. People couldn't handle the memory. The Sanchez house was sold to a young couple from Ohio who got a murder discount and didn't know the full history until after they moved in. They painted the cream exterior a cheerful blue. They planted new rose bushes over the soil where the police had trampled. The investigation was officially moved to the inactive file in 1987. Thorne retired 2 years later, a bitter man with a stomach ulcer and a box of photocopied case files in his garage that he couldn't bring himself to burn. He died in 1994 of a heart attack, taking his hunch and his frustration to the grave. He never knew how close he had been. He never knew that the man he spoke to on the street that October night was the monster he had hunted. But science does not sleep. While the case gathered dust, a revolution was brewing in laboratories across the world. In Leicester, England, a geneticist named Alec Jeffreys was stumbling upon a discovery that would change the course of human justice. He found that sequences of DNA were unique to every individual, like a biological fingerprint. By the mid-90s, the term DNA profiling was making headlines. The O.J. Simpson trial brought it into every living room in America. Suddenly, juries wanted science. They wanted the helix. In the archives of the Orange County Sheriff's Department, the new cold case unit was formed. It was a small, underfunded office in the basement, staffed by 2 detectives who were nearing retirement and one ambitious rookie named Sarah Jenkins. Their job was to sift through the wreckage of the past, looking for anything that could be tested with the new technology. Sarah was young, sharp, and relentless. She had grown up hearing about the Sanchez case. It was the local boogeyman story. When she was assigned to the unit, she went straight for Box 85 to 4022. She blew the dust off the lid. She opened the files, smelling the old paper and the scent of failure. She found the autopsy report. She read the line that Dr. Thorne had dictated all those years ago. Trace evidence found under fingernails. Exhibit B. She went to the evidence locker. It took 3 days to find it. The filing system from the 80s was a disaster. But finally, in the back of a freezer that hummed with a rattling fan, she found the plastic bag. The tape was yellowed and peeling. The label was faded. But inside, the swab was still there. It was a long shot. The sample was degraded. It had been through power outages, freezer transfers, and 30 years of neglect. But it was something. "Let's see who you are," Sarah whispered to the vial. She sent it to the state lab. The wait began. Weeks of silence. And then, the first blow. The result came back. Partial profile generated. It was enough to run, but not enough to be perfect. They ran it through CODIS, the national database of convicted offenders. The computer screen blinked. The cursor pulsed. Searching. Searching. And then, an O match found. Sarah slammed her fist on the desk. The killer wasn't in the system. He wasn't a felon. He wasn't a known rapist. He was a clean skin. This is the wall that stops 90% of cold cases. You have the DNA, but you have no name to attach it to. It's like having a fingerprint, but no finger. The killer was out there, living his life, completely invisible to the criminal justice system. But Sarah Jenkins wasn't Marcus Thorne. She didn't accept walls. She looked at the profile again. It was a partial match, yes. But it was unique. And she knew that technology was evolving faster than the killer could age. If she couldn't find him in the criminal database, maybe she could find him somewhere else. The world was changing. People were spitting into tubes to find out if they were Irish or Italian. They were uploading their genetic codes to the internet, building massive public family trees. They were unknowingly building a trap for the monsters hiding in their branches. Sarah looked at the file. She looked at the date, 1985. She looked at the victim's photo, Elena, smiling, full of life. "I'm not done," she said to the empty room. "We're just getting started." The chase had entered a new dimension. It was no longer about shoe prints and alibis. It was about nucleotides and chromosomes. The frozen clue had thawed, and it was ready to speak. The question was the world ready to hear what it had to say? And more importantly, was David Sterling, now a grandfather living a quiet life in a retirement community, ready for the past to come knocking? The silence of the suburbs was about to be broken by the sound of science. If you were to paint a portrait of the American dream in the late 20th century, you would paint David Sterling. He was the man you wanted on your bowling team because he was consistent, but never competitive enough to make things awkward. He was the neighbor who owned a snowblower, even in Southern California where it never snowed, just in case he moved to the mountains one day. He was prepared. He was steady. He was the guy who bought Girl Scout cookies by the crate, not because he liked them, but because he couldn't say no to a child in a sash. To his co-workers at the structural engineering firm in Irvine, Sterling was Dave from logistics. A man of beige cardigans and sensible sedans. He had a corner cubicle decorated with drawings his daughters had made in crayon, stick figures of a happy family standing under a yellow sun. He never missed a deadline. He never raised his voice in a meeting. When the office threw a retirement party or a baby shower, Dave was the one cutting the cake, making sure everyone got a slice, his smile fixed and pleasant, his eyes crinkling at the corners behind wire-rimmed glasses. But this is the terrifying paradox of the psychopath. The mask is often more convincing than the real face. Criminologists call it the mask of sanity. It is a camouflage so perfect, so meticulously crafted, that it doesn't just fool the observer. It almost seems to fool the wearer. David Sterling didn't walk around wringing his hands or muttering to himself. He didn't have a basement full of dark secrets, at least not physical ones. His basement was full of camping gear and holiday decorations, organized in plastic bins labeled with a label maker. To understand how a man can bludgeon a young woman to death on a Tuesday and then attend a parent-teacher conference on a Wednesday, you have to understand the architecture of his mind. It is a house with many rooms, and the doors between them are made of steel. In one room, there is the monster, the dark, impulsive, violent entity that needed to possess and destroy Elena Sanchez. But once that door was closed, locked, and the key swallowed, Sterling simply walked into the next room. The dad room. The husband room. The good neighbor room. He didn't live with guilt. Guilt implies a conscience. He lived with management. For the next 10 years, while the Sanchez family withered under the weight of their grief, David Sterling flourished. He got a promotion in 1988. He bought a boat in 1990, a small fishing vessel he named the Escape. He took his family to Disneyland, standing in line for hours to ride Space Mountain, laughing as the coaster dipped into the dark. Did he think of the darkness in Elena's living room? Did the screams of the riders remind him of the silence of his victim? We will never know. But to the outside world, he was just a dad holding his daughter's hand. The proximity is what makes the skin crawl. Sterling didn't move away. Most killers flee. They run from the geography of their crime, haunted by the location. But Sterling stayed. He lived less than 3 miles from the crime scene for decades. He drove past the intersection of Calle de la Paz on his way to the grocery store. He saw the seasons change on the street where he had taken a life. There is a psychological theory that suggests this wasn't just laziness, it was a trophy. The neighborhood itself was his souvenir. Every time he drove past that blue bungalow, every time he saw the new owners mowing the lawn, he felt a surge of secret power. He knew something they didn't. He was the author of the neighborhood's defining tragedy, and he was walking among them, unnoticed, untouched. He was God in the suburbs. In 1995, 10 years after the murder, the local newspaper ran an anniversary piece. A decade of silence. The Sanchez case remains cold. Sterling likely read it at his breakfast table, spreading marmalade on his toast. He might have even shook his head, sighing to his wife. Terrible shame. I still remember that poor girl. This is the ultimate violation. It's not just the murder, it's the mockery. It's the killer inserting himself into the grieving process of the community he destroyed. He became a shapeshifter, mirroring the emotions of those around him so perfectly that no one ever looked twice. But cracks in the mask are inevitable, even if they are invisible to the naked eye. While Sterling was outwardly perfect, there were moments, tiny, microscopic glitches in the matrix, that, in hindsight, paint a disturbing picture. A neighbor recalled a time when Sterling's dog dug up a flower bed. Sterling didn't yell. He simply stared at the animal with a cold, dead intensity that made the neighbor shiver. He didn't hit the dog. He just switched off. For a split second, the good neighbor vanished and the thing underneath peeked out. But then a blink, a smile, and Dave was back. Sorry about that. Fido's a bit rambunctious today. The neighbor forgot about it until 30 years later. As the millennium turned, the world began to accelerate. The internet arrived. Cell phones became ubiquitous. The fear of the stranger morphed into the fear of the terrorist. The Sanchez case was buried under layers of new anxieties. Sterling was now in his 50s. His daughters were grown and off to college. He was entering the golden years of his life, the time when a man is supposed to relax, to reflect on his legacy. And what a legacy he thought he had secured. He had beaten the system. He had committed the perfect crime. In his mind, the statute of limitations on morality had expired. He had outlasted the investigation. Detective Thorne was dead. The evidence was forgotten. He was safe. He began to let his guard down. Not in a sloppy way. He didn't start confessing at bars, but he became comfortable in his skin. He volunteered for the neighborhood watch. Let that sink in. The man who had slipped through a locked door to kill a woman was now patrolling the streets in a reflective vest, holding a flashlight, protecting the community from suspicious characters. It is an irony so dark it feels like fiction. But it was his reality. He likely enjoyed the authority. He enjoyed the trust. It was the ultimate cover. Who suspects the man with the flashlight? But while Sterling was patrolling the streets, a different kind of patrol was starting in the laboratories of the world. The Human Genome Project was launched. Scientists were decoding the book of life, letter by letter. The very biological essence that Sterling was made of, the skin he shed, the saliva he swallowed, was being translated into a language that computers could read. Sterling was an engineer. He understood structures. He understood loads and stress points. But he didn't understand biology. He didn't understand that he was walking around with a barcode stamped on every cell of his body. He thought his secret was locked in his brain, but it was written in his blood. He had no idea that a small plastic vial in a freezer in Santa Ana was waiting for him. He had no idea that the useless trace evidence from 1985 was about to become the most dangerous weapon in the world. Life in the Sterling household continued its placid rhythm. Sunday barbecues. 4th of July fireworks. Retirement parties. Sterling retired in 2010. They threw him a bash at the local Elks Lodge. People gave speeches. "Dave is the most reliable man I know," his boss said, raising a glass of cheap champagne. "A man of integrity." Sterling stood there, beaming, his arm around his wife. He looked at the room full of people who loved him, respected him. He must have felt invincible. He had won. The game was over. The clock had run out. But crimes like this don't have an expiration date. The universe has a way of balancing the scales, even if it takes a lifetime. The perfect neighbor was about to face a force he couldn't charm, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't hide from. He was about to face the relentless, mathematical certainty of genetic genealogy. The transition from the era of gut instinct policing to data-driven justice was slow, painful, but inevitable. And as Sarah Jenkins sat in that basement office in 2023, staring at the glowing monitor, she wasn't looking for a monster. She was looking for a ghost. And ghosts, as it turns out, have family trees. The mask of the ordinary was about to be peeled away, layer by agonizing layer. And underneath, the world would finally see the face that Elena Sanchez saw in her final moments. The tragedy of the perfect neighbor isn't just that he killed, it's that he lived. He stole a life, and then he stole 40 years of peace from a community that embraced him. He was a parasite feeding on the trust of good people. But the host was waking up. And as we move into the next phase of this story, we leave the comfortable, sun-drenched facade of Sterling's life and dive into the cold, digital labyrinth of the investigation that would hunt him down. The detectives are done knocking on doors. Now they are knocking on the very DNA of the human race. The net is cast. The water is still. But beneath the surface, the shark is about to be snagged. The year is 2023. The world has become a place of digital noise. We live in the cloud, our lives backed up on servers we will never see. But in the quiet, climate-controlled basement of the Orange County Sheriff's Department, Detective Sarah Jenkins was dealing with something far more ancient than a hard drive. She was dealing with the biological hard drive of humanity itself. The initial DNA run through CODIS, the National Criminal Database, had been a dead end. That blinking, NO match found cursor was usually the tombstone for a cold case. It meant the killer had never been arrested for a felony, never had his cheek swabbed, never entered the system. In the old days, that was it. Game over. You put the file back in the box and hoped for a deathbed confession. But Sarah Jenkins belonged to a new breed of investigator. She didn't just have a badge. She had a curiosity that bordered on obsession. She knew about a new, controversial, and incredibly powerful tool that was quietly revolutionizing law enforcement: investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. It sounds clinical, but in practice, it is a high-stakes treasure hunt through time. It works on a simple, devastating premise. Even if you have never committed a crime, your DNA is not just yours. It belongs to your family. It is shared with your parents, your siblings, your second cousins, and that great aunt you've never met who lives in Ohio. If any one of them has uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy site, hoping to find their heritage or build a family tree, they have unwittingly created a beacon that points directly to you. Sarah got approval from the district attorney. It wasn't easy. The legal ethics of IgG were still a gray area, a frontier of privacy versus justice. But the brutality of the Sanchez murder, the frozen silence of 38 years, tipped the scales. She was given the green light. The degraded DNA sample from 1985, the Exhibit B that had sat next to a toaster for a decade, was sent to a specialized private lab. This wasn't a police lab. This was a facility that usually handled high-end medical research. They didn't just look at the simple markers used for CODIS. They performed whole genome sequencing. They took the fragmented, rotting code of the killer and rebuilt it, letter by letter, until they had a digital file containing hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. They turned the biological ghost into a data file. Sarah uploaded this file to WhoDidIMarry, a public database where users voluntarily opt in to law enforcement searches. She hit enter and held her breath. The screen populated. It wasn't a direct hit. There was no David Sterling with a home address and a phone number. Instead, there was a list of names. Strangers. People who had no idea they were about to become part of a murder investigation. The top match was a third cousin. In the world of genealogy, a third cousin shares about 0.78% of your DNA. It sounds like nothing, a drop in the ocean. But to a genetic genealogist, it's a lifeline. It means you share a set of great-great-grandparents. Sarah printed out the family tree. It was massive. It spanned 5 generations. It started in the late 1800s with a couple named Martha and Elias, farmers in rural Nebraska. They had 7 children. Those 7 children had children. And so on, branching out like a chaotic vine across America. Sarah and her team, a small group of analysts who looked more like librarians than cops, began the grueling process of reverse genealogy. They weren't moving backward into history. They were moving forward. They had to trace every single descendant of Martha and Elias down to the present day. They used census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, high school yearbooks, and obituaries. They scoured Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. It was a digital dragnet. They were looking for a male. Someone who would have been in Southern California in 1985. Someone who would have been in his 20s or 30s at the time. The tree grew. It covered the walls of the war room, a constellation of sticky notes and red string that looked like the chaotic mind of a conspiracy theorist. But there was order in the chaos. Rule out the women, Sarah commanded. The DNA was male XY. Half the tree vanished. Rule out anyone born after 1970. The killer had to be an adult in 85. Another branch pruned. Rule out anyone who lived and died on the East Coast. Another section gone. Weeks turned into months. The team lived on caffeine and takeout. They were exhausted. their eyes blurring from staring at microfiche and digital scans. But slowly, the forest began to clear. The hundreds of potential suspects dwindled to 50, then 20, then 10. They focused on a specific branch of the family, the Sterlings. The genealogy showed a man named Robert Sterling who moved from the Midwest to California in the 1950s. He had 3 sons, 3 brothers. The detective stared at the 3 names on the whiteboard. 1. Michael Sterling. 2. Thomas Sterling. 3. David Sterling. This was the triage phase. They had to investigate these 3 men without them knowing. They had to be invisible. Michael Sterling was the oldest. In 1985, he was living in San Diego. But a quick check of military records showed he was deployed in West Germany during August of that year. He was halfway across the world when Elena Sanchez died. Cross him off. Thomas Sterling was the youngest. In 1985, he was 14 years old. While not impossible for a juvenile to commit a crime, the profile of the killer, organized, methodical, driving a car, didn't fit a middle schooler. Plus, his school records placed him in a summer camp in Oregon for the entire month of August. Cross him off. That left the middle brother, David Sterling, born 1957. In August 1985, he was 28 years old. Sarah typed his name into the public records database. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Address in 1985, 402, Willow Creek Lane.
Sarah pulled up a map.
She entered the address of the crime scene, 112, Calle de la Paz. She hit directions. The map zoomed in. The blue line appeared. Distance, 2.8 miles. Drive time, 6 minutes. The room went silent. The air was sucked out of the space. It wasn't just close. It was intimate. It was the same grocery stores, the same gas stations, the same air. She dug deeper. DMV records showed that in 1985, David Sterling registered a vehicle, a 1981 Toyota Corolla. Color, tan. Sarah closed her eyes. The witness report from the cold case file flashed in her mind. A tan sedan was seen idling near the corner 2 days before the murder. It had been dismissed at the time as too vague. A tan sedan in the 80s was like a white SUV today, everywhere.
But now?
Now it was a beacon. But here's the problem. David Sterling was a ghost in the criminal system. No felonies. No misdemeanors. Not even a speeding ticket in the last 20 years. He was a registered voter. He paid his property taxes early. He was listed as a donor to the local animal shelter. He's clean, one of the analysts whispered. Too clean. That's the mask, Sarah said, her voice hard. That's how he stayed hidden. But a name on a genealogical chart is not a conviction. In a court of law, you can't say, his third cousin shares DNA with the killer, so it must be him. That's circumstantial. That's a theory, not proof. To arrest David Sterling, a grandfather, a respected community member, they needed a direct match. They needed his DNA, not his cousin's. Not a prediction. They needed the molecules from his own body to match the molecules found under Elena's fingernails. But they couldn't just ask him. If they knocked on his door and asked for a swab, he would lawyer up. He would flee. He would destroy evidence. The element of surprise was their only advantage. They needed to steal his DNA. This is the legal loophole that catches the smartest criminals. We leave our DNA everywhere. On coffee cups, on napkins, on cigarette butts. And the Supreme Court has ruled that once you throw something in a public trash can, you have abandoned your privacy rights to it. It's fair game. Sarah looked at her team. We need a surveillance team. 24/7. I want to know when he sneezes. I want to know when he drinks a soda. I want his trash. The operation was named Project Blue. It was sensitive. If the media got wind that they were tailing a random suburban grandfather for a 40-year-old murder, it would be a circus. It had to be silent. It had to be precise. The team was assembled. Undercover officers in plain clothes. Unmarked cars that looked like beat-up sedans. They set up a perimeter around David Sterling's house, a nice, single-story ranch with a manicured lawn and a flag waving on the porch. Sarah sat in the command van, watching the live feed from a camera mounted on a utility pole. She saw the front door open. An older man stepped out. He was wearing a cardigan and slippers. He picked up the morning paper. He looked up at the sky, checking the weather. He looked harmless. He looked like everyone's grandpa. "That's him," Sarah whispered. "That's the monster." For 38 years, David Sterling had been the hunter. He had stalked Elena Sanchez. He had preyed on the community's trust. But as he stood there on his porch, smelling the morning air, the roles had finally reversed. He was no longer the hunter.
He was the prey.
And he didn't even know the net had already closed. Surveillance is not an action movie. It is a war of attrition fought in the front seats of parked cars, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the stale air of patience. For the team assigned to Project Blue, the target was David Sterling, a man whose life was so aggressively normal it was almost maddening to watch. The operation began on a Tuesday, echoing the day of the murder 38 years prior. The team consisted of 6 officers, rotating in 12-hour shifts. They used 3 vehicles: a beat-up painter's van with a ladder on the roof, a gray sedan with a student driver sticker on the bumper, and a landscaping truck parked down the block. They were the furniture of suburbia, designed to be seen but never noticed. Detective Sarah Jenkins sat in the command van, parked 3 streets over, monitoring the radio feeds and the long-range camera lenses. The objective was simple but legally delicate: abandoned DNA. The Fourth Amendment protects a citizen's person, their home, and their papers. But it does not protect their trash. The Supreme Court has ruled that once an item is discarded in a public space, a napkin left on a food court table, a cigarette butt flicked onto a sidewalk, a soda can tossed into a park bin, it belongs to the world. And right now, the world wanted David Sterling's saliva. But Sterling was a creature of habit, and his habits were obsessively tidy. Day 1 passed with agonizing slowness. Sterling emerged at 8 a.m. He retrieved his mail. He walked the perimeter of his lawn, inspecting the grass for weeds. He went back inside. At noon, he ate lunch on his patio. Through the telescopic lens, the surveillance team could see him eating a sandwich. When he finished, he didn't leave the crusts or the wrapper on the table. He folded the foil into a tiny, perfect square, wiped the table with a napkin, and took everything back inside the house. "He's giving us nothing," Officer Miller whispered over the radio. "He's cleaner than a surgeon." This is the paranoia of the guilty, or perhaps just the discipline of the meticulous. Sterling didn't litter. He didn't spit. He didn't smoke. He was a black hole of biological evidence. Every hour that passed was a gamble. If he spotted the surveillance, if he noticed the painter's van that never seemed to paint any houses, he could destroy evidence inside the home, or worse, run. On day 3, the routine broke. The garage door rumbled open. The beige sedan backed out. "Target is mobile," the radio crackled. "All units stay loose. Do not burn the tail." The convoy moved out, a synchronized dance of vehicles keeping distance, swapping positions to avoid a pattern. Sterling drove like he lived, carefully. Hands at 10 and 2. Full stops at stop signs. He merged onto the 405 freeway, heading north. The detectives' hearts were in their throats. Was he going to the airport? Did he know? He pulled into the parking lot of a large home improvement store. "He's shopping," Sarah said, watching the GPS settle. "Get eyes on him. I want to know what he touches." 2 undercover officers, dressed in jeans and flannel, followed him inside. They maintained a casual distance, pretending to look at power drills and light fixtures. Sterling pushed a cart. He bought a bag of potting soil and a new garden hose. He looked at the price of lumber and shook his head, a mundane, relatable gesture of frustration at inflation. Then, he turned toward the exit. But he didn't leave. He stopped at the small concession stand near the registers. "Target is at the food stand," the undercover officer murmured into his collar mic. "He's ordering." The tension in the command van spiked. This was it. The exchange of money. The receipt.
And
a hot dog and a large soda. Sterling stood by the high-top tables near the exit. He took a bite. He took a sip. "He's eating on sight," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Wait for the trash. Do not move until he walks away." The officers watched, feigning interest in a display of door handles. Sterling ate slowly. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. He crumpled it. He finished the soda, the straw making that hollow, slurping sound as it hit the bottom of the cup. He held the cup in his hand. He walked toward the trash can by the automatic doors. This was the moment, the golden sample. If he dropped that cup, the case was over. Sterling hovered over the bin. But then he paused. He looked at the overflow of trash, the sticky wrappers, the half-eaten pizzas. He frowned. He pulled his hand back. "He's not dropping it," the officer said, panic edging into his voice. Sterling turned and walked out of the store, carrying the cup with him. "He's taking it to the car," Sarah groaned. "He's too neat to use a dirty public bin." Unbelievable. The disappointment was physical. They watched as Sterling got into his sedan, placed the empty cup in his cup holder, and drove away. He would likely take it home and put it in his own trash can, which was protected by law until it was moved to the curb on collection day, 3 days from now. They couldn't wait that long. The surveillance continued. The mood in the van was heavy. They had been inches away. Friday came. The weekend brought a change in rhythm. Sterling's daughter arrived with 2 grandchildren. The dynamic shifted. Sterling was no longer the solitary retiree. He was grandpa. The team watched from a distance as they played in the front yard. He pushed them on the tire swing. He laughed. It is a profound psychological dissonance to watch a man suspected of bludgeoning a woman to death gently wipe a smudge of dirt off a toddler's cheek. It forces you to confront the reality that monsters are not 24-hour beasts. They are part-time, and the rest of the time they are us. Saturday morning, 10 a.m. The daughter packed up the kids to leave. Sterling waved them off from the driveway. He looked energized, perhaps by the visit, or perhaps by the adrenaline of social interaction. He went back into the garage and came out with a bicycle. "Target is on a bike," the spotter called out. "He's wearing a helmet and sunglasses. Heading towards the community park." A bike surveillance is difficult. You can't follow a bike with a car easily without being obvious. The team had to scramble. They deployed an officer on a bicycle of his own, a young detective named Ramirez who looked like a college student. Ramirez pedaled, keeping Sterling in sight. Sterling rode to the local park, a sprawling green space with a man-made lake. He did laps, enjoying the exercise. After 30 minutes, he stopped at a concrete picnic bench near the water. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a water bottle. Not a reusable one. A disposable, plastic Kirkland brand water bottle. He drank. He sat, catching his breath, watching the ducks. He finished the water. He crushed the plastic bottle in his hand, twisting it to minimize the space it took up. Ramirez stopped his bike 50 yards away, pretending to check his phone. "Drop it," he willed silently. "Just drop it." Sterling stood up. He walked toward a blue recycling bin chained to a lamppost. He dropped the bottle. It tumbled in, resting on top of a pile of newspapers. Sterling didn't look back. He got on his bike and pedaled away, whistling a tune that carried on the wind. "Item is in the bin," Ramirez whispered. "Target is leaving the sector." "Secure it," Sarah ordered. "Now. Before a maintenance crew clears it. Before a gust of wind takes it. Go." Ramirez waited until Sterling turned the corner. Then he moved. He didn't run. That would draw attention. He walked briskly with purpose. He reached the bin. He had a pair of latex gloves in his pocket. He slipped them on in one fluid motion. He reached in. He bypassed the newspapers. He grabbed the crushed plastic bottle. It was still warm from Sterling's hand. There was condensation on the inside. Saliva on the rim. "Package secured," Ramirez said, slipping the bottle into an evidence bag he had concealed in his windbreaker. He rode his bike back to the rendezvous point, his heart hammering a rhythm against his ribs. He was carrying the ghost of 1985 in his jacket pocket. The drive to the crime lab was done in silence. No radio. No chatter. Sarah Jenkins held the evidence bag on her lap. The bottle looked like trash. It was trash. But it was also the most valuable object in the state of California. The lab technicians were waiting. They had been prepped for a priority 1 rush. In a normal case, DNA testing takes weeks. For this, they would work through the night. The process was delicate. They needed to extract the cells from the rim of the bottle, amplify the DNA, and then compare it to the profile generated from the crime scene evidence. Sarah sat in the waiting room of the lab. The clock on the wall ticked. 10 p.m. Midnight. 2 a.m. She drank coffee that tasted like battery acid. She thought about Elena Sanchez. She thought about the open door. She thought about the perfect neighbor watering his flowers. At 3:15 a.m., the door to the lab opened. The lead technician, a woman named Dr. Eris, a different Eris from the me in the 80s, stepped out. She held a clipboard. Her face was unreadable. Sarah stood up. Her legs felt numb. Well, Dr. Eris didn't smile. This wasn't a happy moment. It was a heavy one. We ran the markers, she said softly. We compared the STR profile from the bottle to the profile from the fingernail scrapings. She turned the clipboard around. The numbers were aligned in 2 columns. The alleles matched perfectly at every single locus. The probability of a random match was 1 in quadrillions. It's him, Sarah, Dr. Eris said. David Sterling is the source of the DNA found on Elena Sanchez. The breath rushed out of Sarah's lungs. It wasn't triumph. It was a profound sense of gravity. The theory was gone. The speculation was over. The science had spoken with absolute, mathematical finality. We got him, Sarah whispered. She pulled out her phone. Her hand was shaking just a little. She dialed the commander. Wake the team up, she said when the line connected. Get the warrant signed. We're taking him down at dawn. The sun was still hours away from rising, but for the first time in 38 years, the darkness around the Sanchez case was breaking. The perfect neighbor was sleeping in his bed, perhaps dreaming of his boat or his garden. He didn't know that his trash had just betrayed him. He didn't know that the invisible pieces of himself he left behind were currently screaming his name in a laboratory 10 miles away. The hunt was over. The capture was about to begin. And as Sarah walked out into the cool night air, she looked up at the stars and felt a strange connection to the past. The silence was ending. Dawn in the suburbs is usually a sound before it is a sight. It is the distant hum of a freeway, the chirp of a sprinkler system coming to life, the solitary bark of a dog greeting the newspaper carrier. But on this Wednesday morning, the sound was different. It was the low, rhythmic crunch of tires on asphalt, not one car but a caravan, a procession of justice moving under the cover of the fading night. The team assembled at the staging area, a supermarket parking lot 2 miles from David Sterling's home. The briefing was short. Detective Sarah Jenkins looked at the faces of the officers, men and women half the age of the suspect they were about to apprehend. They wore tactical vests over plain clothes, the word sheriff emblazoned in yellow across their backs. There was no need for a SWAT tank or flashbang grenades. They weren't storming a cartel compound. They were going to knock on the door of a grandfather who likely had a pot of coffee scheduled to brew in 10 minutes. Standard approach, the tactical commander said, his voice low. Perimeter secure. Front and back coverage. We treat him as armed and dangerous until he's in cuffs. Remember, he killed once. He lived with it for 40 years. Do not underestimate the desperation of a cornered animal. The convoy moved out. No sirens. No lights. Just the stealthy glide of law enforcement closing the net. As they turned onto Willow Creek Lane, the street was still asleep. The streetlights buzzed with that familiar sodium orange glow, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawns. The team parked silently, blocking the driveway, blocking the street. Doors opened. Boots hit the pavement. The sound of Velcro adjusting, of weapons being checked, felt deafening in the silence. Sarah walked up the driveway. She had walked this path in her mind 1,000 times over the last few months. She knew the layout of the house from the blueprints. She knew the schedule. She knew the man inside. But she had never looked him in the eye. She reached the front door. It was painted a welcoming shade of sage green. A wreath of dried flowers hung in the center. A welcome mat sat beneath her feet. The irony was sharp enough to cut. She raised her fist and knocked. 3 hard, authoritative raps that echoed through the frame of the house. Sheriff's Department. Open the door. The silence that followed was heavy. Inside the house, the rhythm of a life was being interrupted. A light flickered on in the hallway. Then another. The shadow of feet moving toward the door. The deadbolt slid back with a metallic clack. The handle turned. The door opened. David Sterling stood there. He was wearing a plaid bathrobe over pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep, his glasses missing. He squinted at the wall of officers, at the guns held at the low ready, at the grim faces of the people who had come to take his life away. Is there a problem?" he asked. His voice was thick with sleep, confused. He looked like a man who thought his car had been broken into, or perhaps there was a gas leak on the block. He played the part perfectly. The innocent homeowner. The bewildered citizen. Sarah stepped forward, her badge catching the porch light. "David Sterling?" "Yes. I am Detective Sarah Jenkins with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. You are under arrest for the murder of Elena Sanchez." The reaction was microscopic. If you blinked, you missed it. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a denial. It was a physical deflation. The air seemed to leave his body. His shoulders slumped by a fraction of an inch. The color drained from his face, turning it the color of old parchment. For a split second, the eyes that looked back at Sarah weren't the confused eyes of a grandfather. They were the cold, dead eyes of the man who had stood in a living room in 1985. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply nodded, a slow, resigned motion. "I need my glasses," he whispered. "We'll get them for you," an officer said, stepping in to secure his wrists. The click of the handcuffs was the final period at the end of a very long sentence. As they led him down the driveway, the neighborhood began to wake up. The commotion had drawn attention. Curtains twitched. Porch lights flickered on. Doors opened tentatively. People in bathrobes and slippers stepped out into the cool morning air, clutching their mugs of coffee, trying to process the impossible image before them. They saw David. Their David. The man who loaned them tools. The man who waved at their kids. They saw him being guided by 2 officers, his hands behind his back, his head bowed. "David," a neighbor called out, his voice trembling. "David, what's going on?" Sterling didn't look up. He couldn't. The shame was a physical weight. The mask had not just slipped, it had been ripped off, exposing the raw, ugly truth underneath. The perfect neighbor was gone. In his place was a prisoner. They placed him in the back of the unmarked sedan. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat. She watched him in the rear-view mirror. He was staring out the window, watching his house disappear as they turned the corner. He was watching his life, his garden, his boat, his reputation, vanish into the rear view. He didn't say a word. The silence in the car was suffocating. Back at the station, the atmosphere was electric. Word had spread. The cold case unit had brought in a big one. Officers from other divisions peeked their heads out of cubicles to catch a glimpse of the ghost. Sterling was processed. Fingerprinted. Mugshot taken. The mugshot would be plastered on every news station by noon. It showed a man who looked tired, defeated. A man who looked entirely ordinary. And that was what terrified everyone who saw it. He looked like us. They led him to interrogation room 2. It was a small, windowless box with soundproof padding on the walls and a stainless steel table bolted to the floor. The air was cold, recycled. Sarah walked in, carrying a thick file folder. She set it on the table with a heavy thud. She sat across from him. Sterling had been given his glasses. He sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at a spot on the wall. He was composed now. The shock of the arrest had faded, replaced by a wall of icy resolve. "Do you know why you're here, David?" Sarah asked. He looked at her. His eyes were flat. "You said it was about Elena. The girl down the street." "The girl you murdered," Sarah corrected, her voice steady. "I didn't kill anyone," he said. The denial was automatic, rehearsed. He had been saying it to himself in the mirror for 38 years. He had convinced himself it was true. "I was a good neighbor to her. I helped her mother." Sarah opened the file. She pulled out a photo of Elena, then a photo of the crime scene, then finally the DNA report. She slid the report across the table. We have your DNA, David. We have it from under her fingernails. And we have it from the water bottle you threw away in the park on Saturday. It's a match. A perfect match. 1 in a quadrillion. Sterling looked at the paper. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He knew what it was. It was the science he had ignored. It was the ghost he thought he had outrun. Science makes mistakes, he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. Not this kind, Sarah said. It's over, David. The life you built, the perfect neighbor routine, it's done. We know you were there. We know you drove the tan Corolla. We know you watched her. She leaned in. What I want to know is, why? You had a wife. You had a job. You weren't a criminal. Why her? Why that day? Sterling went silent. He shut down. He stared at his hands, watching the way the fluorescent light reflected off his wedding ring, a ring he would soon have to surrender. This silence is common in cold cases. The suspect realizes that talking can only hurt them. They retreat into the fortress of their mind. But his body betrayed him. Sarah watched his carotid artery pulsing in his neck. She saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. He was terrified. Not of jail, perhaps, but of the exposure. The humiliation. The fact that everyone, his wife, his daughters, his friends, now knew he was a monster. While Sarah pressed him in the room, the detectives outside were dismantling his life. A search warrant was being executed at his home. The perfect neighbor's sanctuary was being turned inside out. They went through his garage. They went through his computer. They went through the boxes in the attic. They were looking for trophies. Souvenirs. Many killers keep a token, a piece of jewelry, a driver's license, a lock of hair, to relive the moment. They found a small, locked metal box in the back of a tool chest in the garage. It was dusty, hidden behind jars of nails. They cut the lock. Inside, there were no body parts. There was no bloody knife. But there was a collection of newspaper clippings. Yellowed, brittle clippings from 1985. Every article written about Elena Sanchez. Every plea from her parents. Every update on the stalled investigation. And at the bottom of the box, a single, small item wrapped in tissue paper. A wind chime. A small, ceramic wind chime. The one that used to hang by Elena's front door. The one that was missing from the crime scene photos. The detective in the garage held it up, his hand shaking in his latex glove. "We got it," he whispered into his radio. "We got the trophy." Back in the interrogation room, Sarah received the message through her earpiece. She looked at Sterling. He was still staring at the wall, trying to maintain his stoic facade. "We found the box, David," she said softly. Sterling's head snapped up. For the first time, there was genuine panic in his eyes. "We found the clippings. And we found the wind chime." The mask shattered. The perfect demeanor cracked into 1,000 pieces. Sterling put his head in his hands. A sound escaped him, a low, guttural moan that sounded like an animal in a trap. It wasn't a confession in words, but it was a confession in spirit. He knew. He knew that the one thing he had kept to remember her by was the thing that would bury him. The interrogation ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Sterling asked for a lawyer. The interview was terminated. But as they let him out to be processed for the county jail, he looked different. He looked smaller. The neighbor was gone. The predator was exposed. Outside the station, the media had assembled. The news had broken. Cold case cracked. The headline screamed, "Neighbor arrested." The cameras flashed as Sterling was led from the building to the transport van. The world saw him now. The illusion was stripped away. But the most chilling reaction came from the community he had left behind. On Willow Creek Lane, the police tape was back up, this time around Sterling's house. The neighbors stood in the street, the same way they had stood in 1985. But this time, the fear wasn't of the unknown. It was of the known. "I had him over for Thanksgiving," one woman sobbed to a reporter. "He held my baby. He had a key to my house," another man said, his face pale. "We trusted him." This is the true terror of the case. It's not just the violence of the murder. It's the violence of the betrayal. David Sterling hadn't just killed Elena, he had killed the idea of trust. He had proven that you can never really know who is living next door. You can never really know what is behind the smile, or the wave, or the offer to help carry your groceries. As the sun set on that day of reckoning, David Sterling sat in a solitary cell, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed with his gray skin. He was no longer the master of his universe. He was just a number. Inmate 28,409. But on the other side of town, in a quiet cemetery, the wind blew through the trees. It rustled the grass on a grave that had been silent for too long. Justice, delayed by decades, had finally arrived. The ghost of Calle de la Paz could finally rest. But for the living, the nightmare was just entering a new phase. The trial was coming, and the secrets of the perfect neighbor were about to be dragged into the unforgiving light of the courtroom. The arrest of David Sterling didn't just break the news cycle, it broke the heart of a community. When the headlines hit, "The Monster Next Door," cold case cracked after 38 years, the shockwaves traveled far beyond the borders of Orange County. It was a story that tapped into a primal suburban fear, the terrifying realization that the wolf isn't lurking in the dark woods, but is mowing the lawn right across the street. But for the families involved, the arrest wasn't the end of the story. It was the ripping open of a wound that had never truly healed. Elena Sanchez's parents, Maria and Roberto, had passed away in the early 2000s. They died with their daughter's photo on their nightstand, their hearts heavy with unanswered questions, never knowing the man who took her was living just a short drive away. The tragedy of a cold case is often this. Justice is a relay race, and sometimes the people who started it aren't there to cross the finish line. The burden now fell to Elena's younger sister, Sofia. In 1985, Sofia was just a teenager, shielded from the gruesome details by her protective parents. Now, she was a woman in her 50s, standing in front of a phalanx of microphones, her hands shaking as she held a picture of the sister who remained forever 24. "We always thought it was a stranger," Sofia told the press, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "We thought it was a drifter, someone who passed through and vanished. To know it was him, to know he looked my mother in the eye at the funeral, that he shook my father's hand. It's not just murder, it's torture. He tortured us with his presence." As the dust settled on the initial shock, the inevitable question arose. How? How did a man living 3 miles away, driving a car that matched witness descriptions, slip through the net for 4 decades? The answer lay in the chaotic, analog nature of 1985 police work. Detective Sarah Jenkins and her team began the tedious process of a postmortem on the original investigation. They pulled the old field notes, the handwritten logs that smelled of mildew and time. What they found was a tragedy of missed connections. In a beat-up notebook from a patrol officer who had knocked on doors the week after the murder, there was a scribbled entry. Resident at 402 Willow Creek. David Sterling. Polite. Helpful. Said he saw a suspicious white van. No other info. Sterling hadn't hidden. He had inserted himself. He had used the classic strategy of the helpful witness. By offering a false lead, a suspicious white van, he had misdirected the police, sending them chasing a phantom vehicle while he drove his tan Corolla right under their noses. In the pre-computer age, his name on that index card was just one of hundreds. It was never cross-referenced. It was never flagged. He was just a nice guy trying to help. The investigation also uncovered the tan sedan lead. A neighbor had reported a tan car idling near Elena's house 2 nights before the murder. Police had pulled over dozens of tan cars in the area. But Sterling's car? It was parked in his garage. When police drove by his house in '85, they saw a family man washing his boat. They didn't see a suspect. They saw a mirror image of themselves. This is the blinding power of bias. The detectives of 1985 were looking for a monster. They weren't psychologically prepared to find a monster who coached Little League. Now, in 2024, the legal battle began. The trial of the People v. David Sterling was set to be the media event of the year. The defense team, hired with Sterling's retirement savings, adopted a strategy that was as bold as it was desperate: deny the science. Their narrative was simple. David Sterling was a pillar of the community, a grandfather, a man with a spotless record. The DNA? It was a mistake, a contamination, a lab error from a sample that was 40 years old and had been stored in a basement next to a toaster. They tried to paint the investigative genetic genealogy process as an invasion of privacy, a witch hunt based on unreliable ancestry websites. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sterling's lawyer boomed in his opening statement, gesturing to the frail-looking man in the beige cardigan. Look at this man. Does he look like a killer? Or does he look like a victim of a system desperate to close a file? Sterling played his part perfectly. He sat in the defendant's chair, looking small, confused, and harmless. He wore his reading glasses. He took notes with a trembling hand. He was the grandpa defense personified. But the prosecution, led by a sharp, relentless district attorney named Anita Rao, didn't play the game of optics. She played the game of mathematics. She called the scientists to the stand. One by one, they dismantled the defense's argument. They explained the stability of DNA. They explained the odds. 1 in a quadrillion, the lead geneticist stated, looking directly at the jury. To put that in perspective, you would have to populate the Earth with 1,000,000 times more people than currently exist to find another random match. It is not a mistake. It is a signature. It is his autograph on the crime. But the emotional climax of the trial wasn't the science. It was the trophy. When Detective Jenkins took the stand, the courtroom went silent. She walked the jury through the surveillance, the discarded water bottle, the arrest. And then she opened the evidence box. She held up the plastic bag containing the ceramic wind chime found in Sterling's garage. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. Sophia, sitting in the front row, let out a sob that sounded like a physical blow. It was the undeniable link. You can argue about DNA contamination. You can argue about degraded samples. But you cannot explain why a perfect neighbor has the victim's missing wind chime wrapped in tissue paper in a locked box for 38 years. He didn't just take a life, Jenkins said, her voice steel. He took a souvenir. He kept it to remind himself of the power he felt that day. He kept it because he was proud. Sterling, who had maintained his stoic mask for weeks, finally looked away. He couldn't look at the wind chime. It was the object that bridged his two worlds, the dark memory he cherished and the bright, fake life he lived. Now they had collided. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. It was a record for a capital murder case in the county. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He didn't look at Sterling. We find the defendant, David Sterling, guilty of murder in the first degree. The word guilty hung in the air, heavy and absolute. There was no cheering. This wasn't a sports match. It was a tragedy reaching its conclusion. Sophia Sanchez closed her eyes and tilted her head back, tears streaming down her face. The ghost of her sister was finally, truly heard. Sterling didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, blinking. The realization was setting in. The boat, the garden, the grandkids, the freedom, it was all gone. He would die in a concrete box. The perfect neighbor would be buried in a prison cemetery. As the bailiffs moved in to cuff him, real cuffs this time, heavy steel shackles, Sterling turned to his family in the gallery. His wife was gone. She couldn't bear to come. His daughters were there, their faces masks of conflict and horror. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a lie. But he said nothing. He turned away. The echoes of the past had finally caught up to the present. The cold case was hot. The silence was broken. But outside the courthouse, as the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions, a different kind of silence was descending on Willow Creek Lane. The neighbors there were taking down the "Support Our Neighbor" signs they had initially put up. They were changing their locks. They were looking at each other with suspicion. The trial was over, but the psychological scar remained. David Sterling had proven that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like the man who waters your plants while you're on vacation. And that is a realization that doesn't fade when the gavel bangs. When the heavy steel doors of the San Quentin Reception Center slammed shut behind David Sterling, the sound was final. It was a mechanical punctuation mark at the end of a life built on lies. For Sterling, the transition was abrupt and absolute. One day, he was a retiree deciding which fertilizer to use on his prize-winning roses. The next, he was inmate 28409, a number in a sea of orange, stripped of his name, his dignity, and his carefully constructed identity. The man who had spent 40 years controlling his environment, from the precise temperature of his home to the secrets in his head, was now in a world where he controlled nothing. Not when he ate, not when he slept, and certainly not how the world perceived him. But while Sterling was locked away, the prison he created on the outside remained wide open. The true devastation of a crime like this isn't contained within the four walls of a cell. It spills out like toxic waste, contaminating the soil of the community he left behind. The neighborhood of Willow Creek Lane, once the epitome of suburban tranquility, had become a landscape of psychological ruin. The house at 402 Willow Creek, Sterling's sanctuary, the place where he polished his boat and hosted 4th of July barbecues, was no longer just a house. It was a monument to deception. It sat empty now, the curtains drawn, the lawn beginning to yellow as the sprinklers were turned off. People drove by slowly, slowing their cars to a crawl, pointing cameras out the window. It had become a macabre tourist attraction. The murder house, they called it, even though no murder had happened there. The crime had happened 3 miles away, but the evil? The evil had slept there. It had eaten breakfast there. It had watched television there for 38 years. For the neighbors, the betrayal was a physical sensation, a nausea that wouldn't pass. These were people who had entrusted David Sterling with their spare keys. They had let him water their plants while they were on vacation. They had let him watch their children. Consider the horror of that realization. A young mother who had moved in next door in 2015 recalled a specific afternoon. Her car wouldn't start. David had come over with jumper cables. He was kind, patient. While she fumbled with the hood latch, he had held her 6-month-old daughter. He had bounced the baby on his knee, making silly faces until she giggled. Now, that memory was a poison. She couldn't scrub it out of her mind. She looked at her daughter, now a school-aged child, and felt a cold shiver of violation. The hands that had killed Elena Sanchez had held her baby. The same hands. The same man. It shattered her sense of safety in a way that a break-in never could. A break-in is a violation of space. This was a violation of reality. It proved that her instincts, her mother's intuition, were completely blind. The ripple effect of the verdict tore through the Sterling family with the force of a bomb. This is the collateral damage we rarely speak of in true crime stories. We focus on the victim and the killer, but what about the killer's family? What about the wife who slept beside a murderer for 4 decades? Linda Sterling was a ghost in her own town. She hadn't known. The detectives, the psychologists, everyone who interviewed her came to the same conclusion. She was innocent. She was a victim of his manipulation just as much as anyone else. David had compartmentalized his life so perfectly that she never saw the seam. She remembered the night of the murder in 1985. David had come home late, saying he had car trouble. He had showered immediately. She had thought nothing of it. Why would she?
He was David.
He was the man who fixed things. Now, Linda was left to sift through the wreckage of a marriage that was a lie. Every happy memory, every anniversary dinner, every vacation photo, every quiet moment holding hands was now tainted. Was he thinking about it then? Was he acting? Did he ever really love her? Or was she just part of his camouflage? She became a pariah, not because people blamed her, but because they didn't know what to say to her. How do you ask someone, "How are you?" when their entire existence has been revealed as a fraud? She moved away within months of the arrest, disappearing into anonymity, leaving the house and the memories behind. The void left by the case extended into the legal world as well. The conviction of David Sterling was a watershed moment for California. It sent a chill through the spine of every cold case offender still walking free. For decades, these men had relied on the passage of time as their shield. They believed that if they made it past the 10-year mark, the 20-year mark, they were safe. The evidence would rot. Witnesses would die. The world would forget. But the Sterling case proved that time was no longer an ally, it was an enemy. With every year that passed, science was sharpening its knives. The DNA that was invisible in 1985 was a neon sign in 2024. The message was clear: you can never stop looking over your shoulder. In the district attorney's office, the victory was bittersweet. They had won, yes, but they had also exposed the flaws of the past. The missed clues, the tan sedan, the false witness report, haunted the older detectives. It was a harsh lesson in humility. It forced a complete overhaul of how cold cases were reviewed. No longer would they rely on the gut feelings of the original investigators. Now, every file was treated as a dataset, every assumption challenged, every piece of evidence retested with the latest technology. But perhaps the deepest void was felt by Sofia Sanchez. The trial was over. The cameras were gone. The righteous anger that had fueled her for months began to ebb, leaving behind a hollow silence. Justice had been served, but it hadn't brought Elena back. It hadn't given her parents the chance to see the truth. Sofia visited the cemetery a week after the sentencing. She stood over Elena's grave, the fresh flowers stark against the weathered stone. She told her sister the news. "We got him, Mel. It's over." But as she stood there, she realized that closure is a myth invented by people who haven't suffered loss. There is no closing the door on murder. There is only learning to live in the room with it. The arrest didn't erase the 38 years of missed birthdays, the empty chair at Christmas, the children Elena never had. It simply gave the pain a name. It gave the anger a target. The community of Calle de la Paz tried to move on. The new owners of the Sanchez house, the third family to live there since the murder, continued to tend the garden. But the story was now part of the soil. The perfect neighbor case had become folklore, a cautionary tale told to new residents. Be careful who you trust, they would say. You never really know. This is the lingering legacy of David Sterling. He stole a life, yes. But he also stole the innocence of a neighborhood. He took the American concept of the friendly neighbor and twisted it into something grotesque. He proved that the monsters don't live in caves. They live in ranchers with 3 bedrooms and 2 baths. They drive Toyotas. They pay taxes. They wave. As the sun sets on Orange County, casting long shadows over the palm trees and the stucco walls, the silence returns. But it is a different kind of silence now. It is a wary silence. A watchful silence. The doors are locked a little tighter. The blinds are drawn a little earlier. And when a neighbor waves from across the street, the return wave is hesitant, shadowed by the question that will never fully go away. Who are you really? The story of the crime is over. The story of the punishment has begun. But the story of the fear? That has no ending. It is written into the genetic code of the community now, passed down just like the DNA that finally caught the killer. And as we prepare to look back at the totality of this tragedy, we must confront the most unsettling truth of all. David Sterling was not an anomaly. He was not a glitch in the system. He was a product of it. He was a man who used the camouflage of normalcy to hide in plain sight. And somewhere, in another town, on another quiet street, another perfect neighbor is watching the news, wondering if his own secrets are about to be dug up from the trash. The wind chimes on Calle de la Paz still sing in the Santa Ana winds. But the tune has changed. It is no longer a song of peace. It is a song of vigilance. A reminder that even in the golden light of California, the darkness is always waiting for a door left slightly ajar. San Quentin State Prison is a world stripped of color. It is a universe of gray concrete, rusted iron, and the relentless, echoing clamor of men who have lost their place in society. For David Sterling, the transition from the manicured silence of Willow Creek Lane to the chaotic noise of Block C was a shock to the system that no amount of psychological compartmentalization could buffer. In the suburbs, Sterling had been a man of status. He controlled his environment. He decided when the lawn was mowed, when the boat was waxed, when the lights went out. Inside, he was nothing. He was fresh fish. He was an elderly man with soft hands and expensive dental work, thrown into a tank with sharks. The perfect neighbor was now just a frail body in an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame, stripped of the belt, the tie, and the authority that had once armored him. But the most terrifying aspect of Sterling's new reality wasn't the violence of the prison yard. It was the boredom, the crushing, infinite monotony. For a man who had spent 38 years keeping a secret, the sudden absence of things to hide was maddening. There was no one to fool here. The guards knew what he was. The other inmates knew. The mask he had worn for 4 decades was useless. And without the mask, who was David Sterling? 6 months after the conviction, Detective Sarah Jenkins made the drive up the coast to the prison. The case was closed, legally speaking. The appeal had been denied. The file was boxed and archived. But for Sarah, there was one loose thread that kept snagging in her mind. The DNA had answered who. The timeline had answered when. But nothing, not the trial, not the evidence, not the testimony, had answered why. Why Elena? Why that Tuesday? Why did a man with no prior history of violence wake up one morning and decide to destroy a life, only to go back to sleep that night as if nothing had happened? She sat in the visitation room, a sterile box divided by thick plexiglass. The phone receiver felt greasy in her hand. When the door on the other side buzzed open, Sterling shuffled in. He looked older. The prison diet and the lack of sunlight had turned his skin a translucent, sickly gray. He sat down, not looking at her, staring at the scratches on the counter. He picked up the phone. He didn't say hello. "You're persistent," he rasped.
His voice was different now.
The kindly grandpa inflection was gone, replaced by a flat, metallic tone. He wasn't trying to charm her anymore. "I have questions, David," Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the receiver. "And you have nothing left to lose. The appeals are done. You're going to die in here. So tell me the truth. For Sophia. For the family." Sterling let out a dry, rattling laugh. "The truth? You have your truth. You have your DNA. What more do you want?" "I want to know why," Sarah pressed. "Was it an accident? Did you know her? Was she just there?" Sterling looked up then. For the first time, Sarah saw the entity that had been hiding behind the lawnmower and the neighborhood watch vest. His eyes were empty. Not sad, not angry. Just void. It was the gaze of a man who looked at other human beings and saw only objects. "You think there's a grand reason," Sterling said softly. "You think there's a story, a trauma, a trigger." He leaned in closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "There was no trigger, Detective. It was a Tuesday. I was driving by. I saw the door." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the prison air. "That's it? You saw an open door?" "I saw an opportunity," he corrected. "She was there. I was there. It felt necessary, like scratching an itch. And when it was done, the itch was gone. So I went home." This is the horror that keeps investigators awake at night. We want our monsters to be complex. We want them to be driven by demons we can name: abuse, addiction, psychosis. Because if we can name the cause, we can pretend we can prevent the effect. But David Sterling was offering a far more terrifying reality: the banality of evil. He killed because he could. He killed because the door was open and he wanted to see what it felt like to walk through it. "And afterward?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the nausea rising in her throat. "For 38 years. You watched the parents cry on the news. You shook her mother's hand. Did you feel nothing?" Sterling paused. He seemed to search his memory, not for an emotion, but for a fact. "I felt
safe," he said.
"I knew I was smarter than you. I knew I was smarter than everyone. Every time I walked past that house, I felt a little thrill, a secret that belonged only to me. It made the mundane parts of life bearable." He was a narcissist of the highest order. The murder hadn't been a source of guilt. It had been a battery that powered his ego. He had walked among the sheep as a wolf, deriving pleasure not just from the kill, but from the camouflage. Sarah looked at the broken old man on the other side of the glass. She realized then that there was no humanity to appeal to. There was no remorse buried deep down. David Sterling was a hollow shell, a biological machine that mimicked empathy but felt none. "One last question," Sarah said, playing the card she had held in reserve. "If the technology hadn't caught up, if we hadn't found you, would there have been others?" Sterling's eyes flickered. A tiny, imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was the smile of the perfect neighbor one last time. "I guess we'll never know, will we?" He hung up the phone. The line went dead. He signaled the guard, stood up, and shuffled back toward the metal door without looking back. Sarah sat there for a long time, listening to the dial tone. She had her answer, even if it wasn't the one she wanted. He hadn't stopped because of a moral awakening. He had stopped, or perhaps simply paused, because he had fed the hunger, or because the risk became too great, or perhaps simply because he got busy with raising his daughters and fixing his boat. The randomness of it was the ultimate cruelty. As she walked out of the prison and into the blinding sunlight of the bay, Sarah felt a heavy weight lift. She realized that understanding the why was a fool's errand. You cannot use logic to understand the illogical. You cannot use empathy to understand the sociopathic. But Sterling's capture had triggered something far bigger than his own fate. The Sterling effect was rippling through the state. His arrest had emboldened the cold case unit. If a man as careful, as clean, and as embedded as David Sterling could be caught, then no one was safe. Back at the precinct, the phones were ringing. Detectives from other counties, inspired by the Sanchez success, were dusting off their own boxes. They were submitting their own degraded samples to the labs. The database was growing. The family trees were expanding. In the weeks following Sarah's visit, 3 other cold cases in California saw breakthroughs using the same IgG technology. A rapist in Sacramento was identified after 20 years. A killer in Fresno was pulled from a construction site. The ghosts were rising up, pointing their fingers from the grave. David Sterling thought he was special. He thought he was unique. But in the end, he was just the first domino. His DNA didn't just convict him, it validated a method that would hunt down his peers. He was the catalyst for a cleansing fire that was sweeping through the archives of American crime. Inside his cell, Sterling spent his days staring at the gray wall. He was no longer the protagonist of his own movie. He was a footnote in a legal textbook. The perfect neighbor was gone, dissolved by the very science he never bothered to learn. But the question he left hanging in the air, would there have been others, lingered in the atmosphere. Sarah ordered a review of every unsolved entry, every prowler report, every suspicious circumstance in the vicinity of Sterling's residences from 1975 to 2023. They didn't find bodies. Not yet. But they found patterns. Reports of peeping toms that ceased when Sterling moved. Reports of missing pets. Small, quiet violations that usually precede the big one. The terrifying truth was that Elena Sanchez might not have been the only victim of David Sterling. She was simply the only one who died. The others, the ones he watched, the ones whose locks he tested, the ones whose lives he grazed, would never know how close they came to the darkness. And that, perhaps, is the legacy of the case. It forces us to look at the near misses in our own lives. The times the door was locked. The times we came home early. The times the dog barked. We walk along the edge of the abyss every day, unaware of the eyes watching from the well-kept house across the street. David Sterling sits in a cell in San Quentin, a ghost in an orange jumpsuit. But while his physical world has shrunk to 6 by 8 feet, the shockwave of his capture is expanding outward, rewriting the rulebook of criminal justice across the globe. The Sanchez case didn't just solve a murder. It proved a concept. It demonstrated that in the modern age, anonymity is a myth. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look away from the killer and look at the code. The sequence of as, CS, TS, and GS that convicted Sterling is part of a massive, invisible web that connects us all. When Sterling was a young man in the 1980s, privacy was physical. You closed your blinds. You locked your door. You shredded your documents. But in the 21st century, We have voluntarily surrendered our genetic privacy in exchange for curiosity. Millions of people have spit into plastic tubes to find out if they are 10% Scandinavian or 5% Native American. They upload these results to the cloud, delighted by the colorful pie charts of their heritage. They do not realize that they are also uploading a surveillance network for their entire family tree. When you click "I agree" on those terms and conditions, you are effectively signing a warrant for any relative who has ever committed a crime, past, present, or future. The Sterling precedent, as legal scholars have begun to call it, has terrified the criminal underworld. There is chatter on the dark web, paranoia in the prisons. Career criminals who thought they were careful, who wore gloves, who bleached scenes, who burned evidence, are now realizing that they couldn't scrub the one thing that matters: their lineage. You cannot bleach your third cousin. You cannot burn your great-aunt's ancestry report. In the year following Sterling's conviction, the Orange County Sheriff's Department became a pilgrimage site for detectives from around the world. They came to study the Project Blue files. They came to learn how Sarah Jenkins and her team turned a discarded water bottle into a life sentence. "We are entering the age of the no cold case," the district attorney declared at a national conference. There is no such thing as unsolved anymore. There is only waiting for the data. This new era brings with it a complex ethical storm. Civil liberties groups are raising alarms. Is it fair that a distant relative's hobby can implicate you? Do the police have too much power to rummage through our genetic closets? These are valid, heavy questions. But ask Sofia Sanchez about privacy. Ask the families of the victims who have waited 40 years for an answer. For them, the privacy of a killer is a small price to pay for the peace of the dead. But the revolution isn't just about catching the old ghosts, it's about deterring the new ones. Consider the potential predators watching the news today. The young would-be David Sterlings who are feeling those first dark impulses. They are seeing a man in his 70s dragged out of his comfortable retirement and thrown into a cage. They are seeing that time offers no protection. They are seeing that science is relentless. Criminologists suggest we may see a chilling effect on serial violent crime. If you know that leaving a single hair follicle could lead the police to your door 30 years from now, does it stop you? Does the certainty of capture override the urge to kill? It is a hopeful theory. Perhaps the technology that strips us of our privacy will also strip us of our predators. Back in the suburbs of California, the physical landscape is changing too. The concept of the neighbor is being reevaluated. Neighborhood watch apps are surging in popularity. Ring cameras are on every doorframe. We are watching each other with high-definition scrutiny. But technology can only do so much. The Sterling case taught us that the most dangerous camouflage is social, not physical. David Sterling wasn't caught by a camera. He was caught because he was too normal to be suspected. He was caught because he understood that if you smile, wave, and follow the rules of the Homeowners Association, people will stop looking at you. As the months turned into years, the Sanchez case began to fade from the daily headlines, but it settled into the cultural subconscious. It became a benchmark. When a new cold case was cracked in Ohio, or Florida, or France, the news anchors would reference it, using the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer and the perfect neighbor, David Sterling. He had become an archetype. The Sterling profile. The friendly man with the dark secret. And what of the man himself? Reports from inside San Quentin paint a picture of a man rapidly deteriorating. The narcissism that fueled him on the outside has no fuel on the inside. He has no audience. He has no secrets to hoard. He is reportedly quiet, withdrawn, spending his days reading in the prison library. He reads thrillers. He reads mysteries. One has to wonder if he is critiquing them. They made a mistake here, he might think. They left a fingerprint. Amateurs. But the irony is supreme. He is reading fiction to escape the reality that he created. He is trapped in the very ending he thought he was smart enough to avoid. Meanwhile, the DNA database continues to grow. Every day, thousands more people upload their profiles. The net gets tighter. The mesh gets finer. There are fewer and fewer holes for the monsters to swim through. Detective Sarah Jenkins, now promoted to lieutenant, keeps a framed photo on her desk. It's not of Sterling. It's of Elena. It's a reminder that while the technology is the tool, the human life is the reason. She often looks at the cold case boxes still stacked in the archives, thousands of them, waiting. "We're coming for you," she whispers to the cardboard boxes. "All of you. The era of the perfect crime is over. The era of the genetic witness has begun. And in this brave new world, your blood speaks louder than your alibi ever could." Here is part 11 of the script. This is the conclusion, designed to leave a lingering emotional resonance, focusing on the haunting legacy of the case and the permanent change in the community's psyche. California 1985 cold case cracked. DNA trace unmasks perfect neighbor. Part 11 of 11. The eternal silence. The story of a murder does not end with a gavel strike. It does not end when the heavy steel doors of a prison lock into place, or when the news vans finally coil their cables and drive away to the next tragedy. Those are just plot points in a legal procedural. The real story, the one that lives in the gut of a community, the one that seeps into the groundwater, never truly ends. It echoes. It fades, perhaps like a scar turning white with age, but the tissue underneath is never the same. On Calle de la Paz, the seasons have continued to turn. The relentless summer of 1985 is now a distant, grainy memory, preserved in old photo albums where the colors have shifted to magenta. The trees that were mere saplings when Elena Sanchez took her last breath are now towering oaks, their roots deep in the soil, their branches casting long, complex shadows over the street where a killer once walked freely. The cream-colored bungalow has been repainted 3 times. A new family lives there now, a young couple with a golden retriever and a baby on the way. They know the history, of course. You can't buy a house like this without knowing. But to them, it is just a story. A dark fact to be whispered about at dinner parties, a piece of local trivia that adds a frisson of macabre interest to the property value. They don't feel the weight. They didn't see the police tape fluttering in the hot Santa Ana wind 38 years ago. They didn't see David Sterling standing on the lawn 2 doors down, watering his hydrangeas with the calm detachment of a reptile, watching the body bag come out. But for Sofia Sanchez, the weight is still there. It is lighter now, perhaps. The sharp, stabbing pain of fresh grief has dulled into a chronic, familiar ache, but it is always present. She visits the cemetery less often these days. She doesn't need to stand over a cold stone to feel close to her sister. She feels Elena in the wind chimes that hang on her own porch, replicas of the ones Sterling stole and hid in his box of trophies. She feels her in the laughter of her own grandchildren, a generation that Elena never got to meet. Justice has a strange aftertaste. It satisfies the intellect, but it starves the heart. Knowing that David Sterling is rotting in a cell at San Quentin provides a grim satisfaction, a sense of mathematical balance restored to the universe. But it doesn't undo the theft. It doesn't give back the birthdays, the weddings, the quiet Sunday mornings that Elena was owed. Sterling paid for his crime with his freedom, but he spent the currency of Elena's life long ago, and that account can never be replenished. And what of the perfect neighbor? In the concrete belly of the prison, David Sterling is fading. Reports from the infirmary say he is suffering from the early stages of dementia. The mind that was once a fortress of secrets, a steel trap of compartmentalization, is beginning to crumble. He forgets where he is. He forgets why he is wearing orange. On some days, he reportedly asks the guards if it's time to mow the lawn. He asks if his wife has started dinner. It is a poetic, cruel, and fitting justice. The man who hid the truth for 40 years is now losing the ability to remember it. He is becoming a prisoner not just of the state, but of his own decaying mind. The perfect neighbor is dying by inches, leaving behind only a confused, hollow shell. He will die in that cage, and his body will likely go unclaimed, buried in a potter's field with a number instead of a name. A fitting end for a man who tried to erase another human being from existence. But the legacy of this case stretches far beyond the fate of one man. It has fundamentally changed the way we look at the world right outside our windows. In the years since the conviction, the neighborhood has changed. The fences are higher now. The cameras are omnipresent, blinking their little blue lights in the darkness. The open-door policy of the 1980s is extinct, a relic of a more naive time. We have traded innocence for security. We have traded trust for verification. When a new neighbor moves in, we don't just bake them a pie. We Google them. We check the registries. We scan their faces for cracks in the mask. David Sterling taught us a lesson we didn't want to learn, but one we cannot forget, that the monsters don't look like monsters. They don't dwell in the shadows of the underworld. They stand in the sun of the suburbs. They are polite. They are helpful. They're the ones with the best lawn on the block. They are us. As the sun sets on Southern California tonight, painting the sky in the same brilliant, violent hues of orange and purple that it did on August 13th, 1985, the street is quiet. The sprinklers hiss to life, a rhythmic ch-ch-ch that sounds like a clock ticking down. A car drives slowly down the cul-de-sac, its headlights sweeping across the manicured lawns. Inside the houses, the blue glow of television screens flickers against the windows. Families are eating dinner. Children are doing homework. Life, resilient and stubborn, goes on. But if you listen closely, past the noise of the freeway, past the hum of the air conditioners, past the laughter of the new family in the blue house, you can almost hear the echo. The faint, ghostly sound of a wind chime stirring in a breeze that isn't there. A reminder. The cold case is closed. The file is sealed. The detective has put away the badge. But the silence? The silence on Calle de la Paz is heavy with memory. It holds the secrets of the past, and it watches the present with unblinking eyes. We are safe, we tell ourselves as we turn the deadbolt. We are protected. We know our neighbors. Don't we?